In this episode, we're mixing two things that have gotten a lot of interest lately on the channel. One is North American corn recipes, and the other one is eels. That's right, we're gonna be working with eels. Thanks for joining us today. So located just here, 15 miles south of our store in northern Indiana, there's a waterway, a river, and it's called the Eel River. There is this hidden feature right on the river that one could easily miss if they didn't know what they were looking at. This is a stone fish weir that was built by the indigenous peoples long ago. The fish weirs were used to harvest fish. They worked by funneling migratory fish into a single point of the river, where basket traps were placed to collect the fish. And in our research, we found two different 18th century travel journals, including that of John Heckewelder, a Moravian missionary who lived among the Lenape people. These journals mentioned the Eel River Indians, the native peoples whose name was derived from this very same river. So we're pleased today to present a traditional food that was likely enjoyed by native peoples and settlers alike. We're especially excited about this dish because of its possible connections to the history of this area, history that's right under our feet right here in northern Indiana. So what we're doing here today is another take on succotash. We have done two different episodes on succotash, a summer succotash and a fall succotash, but this is just another kind of variation on it. But this one's got a little different ingredients. Now the main ingredient on all these things, a real staple here, is corn. And we're starting off with a dried hominy corn. This corn has already been processed in a process that the Native Americans used so often that would strip the hulls and sort of cause it to swell up, and then they went ahead and dried it. The corn we're using today is actually from our good friends at the Iroquois White Corn Project. Great people. The corn that they use is a variety that's over 2,000 years old, and it works really well. This is the hulled white corn product, which is a kind of a hominy corn. This is great stuff. The best way to get this corn ready to go into our succotash is to actually cook this overnight in a slow cooker. You can do this without a slow cooker, but you'll need to simmer it for several hours to really get that water into it. It'll puff up, and you can really see that it's definitely changed its texture. But a slow cooker overnight on low with several inches of water over that, and it absorbs a lot of water, like say rice, takes up a lot of room. But this is, you're gonna need to pre-prep this, okay? So we can go ahead now and for our succotash here, we've got about a gallon of water in our pot, and I'm gonna put in a goodly portion of our prepped corn. Now for the rest of our ingredients, we have squash, one of the ones that's mentioned, one of the things that's mentioned in some of these writings. We also have a root vegetable here, and some root vegetables are mentioned. This is celery root, and we'll put in a little bit of that. I mean, you could put potatoes, I suppose, or maybe a parsnip. Now I've got some heritage beans here. These are soaked beans. These are actually given to us by our good friends down at Conner Prairie in Fishers, Indiana, an amazing, wonderful historic site that's down there. That's early 19th century, wonderful site. If you're in that Indianapolis area, you really got to check the site out. They provided these beans for us. We soaked these beans overnight. Let's toss some of those in. And the last thing I'm going to put in now is a little salt and pepper. It's not necessarily likely that, of course, Native Americans would have had salt and pepper at least early on, but we're going to add it for our flavor. Now, before we put in our last ingredient, this is actually going to need to simmer for a little while, or actually boil for a little while, probably 45 minutes, we're guessing, but until these root vegetables get nice and soft and the beans have softened up a little bit. And the final ingredient that's going to go in here, it's not ready yet to put these in, but the eels get to go in next. In the writings of George Laskill in 1794, he mentions the Lenape and the Iroquois peoples. They'd made soup or stew with corn and smoked eels. These eels are going to need to have a little prep work done to them, so I'm actually going to have Kevin come in, talk to us a little about eels, and maybe do a little work to them.
You know, we've been wanting to do an eel recipe for a long time, and frankly, we haven't because we haven't been able to find them. And we finally found a source for smoked eels. These eels come out of Holland. I've always kind of wondered, why is there this river in Indiana called the Eel River? Because there aren't eels in Indiana. Interestingly, though, there used to be. Eels are a migratory fish, and they swam thousands of miles up the tributaries to spawn, and then they would swim back out to the ocean. And so the eels in Indiana, the eels in the Eel River, would actually end up in the Gulf of Mexico. Today in North America, you're going to find eels primarily in saltwater tributaries. Eels, they were everywhere in North America. Very, very common, used to be, no longer today. I'm going to show you how to prepare one of these eels. Now, this eel is very perishable. It's smoked, yes, but probably the way that Native Americans smoked them would have been to smoke them until they were dry, a lot like a jerky. So we're going to use what we have. So here we go. I'm going to start by taking one of these eels. Now these eels have already been gutted, so I'm going to start just by cutting their heads off. I'm going to cut behind the small fin right here. You can save these for later for like soup, things like that. I'm going to take my knife and I'm going to run the knife right along the backbone. The rib bones are very, very fine, and we're probably just going to end up with those in our meat, and you probably won't even know that they're there, all the way to the tail. Now this eel is already fully cooked, and so it's very delicate. So if you're using an eel like this, you're going to have to be careful with this process. Now beyond this, because those rib bones are so fine, I'm not going to worry about them. I'm going to try and get to our spine, and I'm just going to pull this spine out, try and save as much meat as I can. Now I have these two fillets, a little rough, but they'll do for our soup. Now, you can leave the skin on and you'll get more of that of the fish flavor and the smoky flavor in your soup. I think John's going to thank me later for doing this, by the way. I'm going to go on ahead and cut the meat off of the skin, and it's real easy to do. And I'm just going to leave it there, and I'm going to cut it into chunks. And we're going to get some real nice smoky flavor from some of that meat. So our eel meat is ready to be added to the soup.
I'm going to go ahead and put the eel skins in just for about 10 minutes or so to release some of that flavor, and then we'll pull them back out a bit like a bay leaf. And now in goes the meat. Now this is really only going to need to cook for another 5 minutes or so. And now at the very end here, we're going to put in just a little chives at the very top, and now it's almost ready to serve. Here it is. It's time to test this out. I've got Kevin here to help me out because, I mean, eel chowder. We'll find out. Or, I mean, eel succotash.
Yeah, succotash. So there you go.
So let's give this a taste.
Wow. You know, a little more salt, little more pepper.
The eel really held together. Got a great texture. In fact, there's all kinds of textures here.
Mm-hmm. You have the corn underneath.
That hominy flavor.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And there's a beautiful broth.
Yeah, it turns out with a beautiful broth. You know, we went ahead and put those skins in there, and you could see the oils come right up to the top of this. So this is a nice, you know, rich with those oils that brought in a lot of the flavor, and gave it a nice rich broth. We went ahead and took those skins out. But it did not have any, you know, we don't have any, really, this is not fishy at all.
Not at all.
Not fishy
Not at all.
So great flavors and this great connection not only to North America and these different cultures coming together, because eel is very common in the European foodways as well as the Native American. And succotash was definitely one of those foods that was, adopted by the Europeans that came to North America.
This makes me appreciate very much the history of our local area. It's like history under our feet. I knew of the Eel River ever since I've lived here. I never knew the connection, the historic connection,
right,
and where that name came from, and to be able to actually taste this food that likely would have been eaten in one variation or another right here is just really amazing. If you don't have eel, I'm thinking, even herring or even an anchovy, I think you could get away with this.
Some of that similar.
The oiliness, because I say oiliness, but that just contributes to the broth, the flavor of the broth. This is not an overly oily at all. So
very easy to make. This takes a little bit of time, but anything you want to do that turns out, really good, it takes time. So take the time, try to get some eel, definitely get some of this corn because it is really, really good. And you can make this amazing dish. Well, we're back in the kitchen and we have with us a guest, a frequent guest and a great friend of the show, Michael Ragoo. And hey, this one's kind of interesting.
It's simple and it's complex.
And it's called?
To dress a dish of mushrooms.
Mushrooms. Sounds great. Thanks for joining us today. Okay, number one, mushrooms.
Yep.
She means, of course,
mushrooms, but this is from the late 1600s,
Uh-huh.
so they may have called them that.
And this is from Martha Washington's Book of Cookery.
Yep.
And this actually is, originally was a manuscript book that she had in her possession, Martha Washington.
When she married her first husband, Daniel Custis, he gave her this cookbook, passed down in his family, as a wedding gift.
A lot of the recipes from Martha Washington's cookbook come from the 17th century, so they're just maybe even old-fashioned for the 18th century.
Yes.
And the
style of writing is different, the phrasing is different.
Right. So they're a fun book, and there's a great book. There's a version of it that you can find that's called Martha Washington's Book of Cookery. It's done by Karen Hess, and she's a modern food historian. She does a tremendous job in this cookbook of interpreting these very difficult to interpret recipes.
Yeah, she doesn't modernize them. She doesn't make them right for American tastes. She explains what the phrase is, what the obscure words meant.
So, excellent book. I definitely recommend it if you're interested in 17th and 18th century cooking. Definitely go to check it out on Amazon. You will find it'll be a wonderful book. This one is a ragu, right?
It is.
No.
It's not.
It's a what did she call it again?
We are just
dressing.
Yes, we're gonna cook some mushrooms and we're gonna add some things to it to make them a pleasant.
And so she mentions in this recipe like preparing these mushrooms, cutting the red out of them, and all kinds of things.
Well, we don't know if these are dried mushrooms out of the larder, if they are fresh. We don't know what types, varieties, or sizes. If they're being We just don't know why she's doing that. She's removing the gills sometimes. She's peeling them sometimes. I purchased several different varieties from the local market, and I'm going to use those. That's what everybody else can find.
Okay, wonderful. So regular market mushrooms. How do we get started with this?
I've already washed them. I've trimmed them up a little bit, and I'm going to cut them in half. She asks that we cook them, just fry them in the pan.
Okay.
And that's what we're going to start doing.
Okay, so we're cooking with our brazier with charcoal right here in the kitchen. Now, obviously, you cannot do this as a safety issue. In the 18th century, and in this situation, the doors are open, the windows are open to carry all the smoke away. I mean, normally we cook over here at the hearth. And the hearth won't draw unless air can come into the building anyway. And very frequently in the 18th century, they cooked over little braziers just like this in their kitchen. And it was a very frequent kind of a situation. Safety-wise, you can't do this. You're obviously just going to cook it over your regular stove at home, or you're going to cook outside, like they might have done in the 18th century in a summer kitchen. In her original recipe, she's actually very worried about all the moisture coming out of these mushrooms and them filling it up and kind of stewing them.
Right.
And these particular mushrooms, we are not having that problem. She actually says keep drawing the water off.
Yep.
If water builds up in the pan, water is not building up in the pan, so we're just basically frying them up.
We have spirited coals, so we're steaming as soon as they...
Okay, yeah, so it's
the end
taking away
effect's
all
going to be the same, yeah.
Right.
If you'd hand me that piece of onion, just one of the pieces, just pop it in there. Yep. This onion is just adding a little extra flavor. It's not part of the finished dish. If you want to add the salt and pepper, and just to satisfy the regular viewers, a little nutmeg,
No,
please.
nutmeg, she calls for nutmeg in this recipe.
No, I wouldn't add it if she didn't call for it.
So we have some nutmeg, which will definitely make this 18th century.
Okay, our next step is to get the onions out and then just slowly add the cream.
So we're going to add some cream.
Yep. We're just going to let her thicken. Thank you. And then just to your taste, a little parsley.
A little parsley.
Yeah.
Well,
And I just coarsely chopped it.
I'm not the biggest fan of parsley, but
And then just put a little in. That's good.
there we go. Looks great.
We're just going to let that slowly simmer. Imagine this with chanterelles or morels. You know, you could be very specific. I've got 4 different kinds here, but when I was test driving this, I've done this a couple times for demonstrations. I let it go until it gets a little thick. Sometimes I've added some corn flour, some cornstarch.
Cheating.
I know, but it depends on the weather and how much time I've got. But it's a great side for any kind of meat. Last time I did it with pork chops on the side, and it was just wonderful.
This looks delicious. Let's go ahead and serve this up. What
Sounds
do you think?
good. Thank you. Here's our finished dish.
Okay, well, I want to see you eat a little bit first.
I'm gonna because I love this. It doesn't have fish in it. That's why I love it.
There you go. Wonderful.
It is. It really is.
Could use a little more nutmeg, I think. Just the right amount of salt.
Yep.
I might add a little pepper to it even, add a little more, but
One more. Yep.
wow. Super flavors. Really very quick and simple to create.
Yeah, the whole thing is 15 or 20 minutes on the stove.
Right. For vegetarians out there, you could do this with almond milk, even in the time period with the milk or the cream, using, this could be a Lenten dish in the time period. So actually, it's quite a versatile dish. Wonderful, wonderful flavors. Thank you so much for bringing this particular one to us.
It's disappearing before our eyes.
I know, it's going quick. Thank you so much, though, for bringing this particular one, and it's been great. In this episode, we're doing another one of these wonderful 18th century German recipes. This one's called Engelhoffener Soup. Thanks for joining us today. This recipe is simple, it's inexpensive, really quick to make. So it's going to be a great one, whether you're in the field or you can do this at home. If you're a historical reenactor, it's going to be a good one. And if you just want to try it at home, of course, this one is going to be great also. It starts off with beef broth. I've already got some pre-prepared beef broth here. You could use bone broth. You can even check out our episode that we did on bone broth, or even portable soup could be used if you're out in the field. But first, we're just going to pour, I think I've got, I don't know, a quart. So it really depends on exactly how many people you want to serve. I've got about a quart here. Let's get this on the fire. This needs to come up to a boil. Now comes the batter part of this recipe. It's a very simple batter with just a couple of ingredients. Calls for 2 eggs. Just gonna whisk these guys up. I'm gonna add just a touch of milk to thin this up a little bit. And now it calls actually for 3 spoonfuls of flour. And we don't know how big our spoonfuls are here, so I'm just guessing that this is an appropriate spoonful here. I may only go with 2 spoonfuls. Let's get this flour whisked in. There's another spoonful. We'll go ahead and get 3 spoonfuls in there. And we're going to add milk until we get to a batter. And the recipe says something like thicker than omelet batter, a thickish batter. So I'm looking for a right kind of runny consistency. You don't want it to pour right off, but you definitely want it to come off of this. You don't want it to stick to the thing. So that's what we're shooting for consistency. We probably want to make sure that it stays this consistency. You know, if you're like waiting for that to boil over here, we have to make sure that this stays this consistency. It could be that as it kind of sets for a little bit, it'll get too thick. We don't want it to be like that. So if it gets too thick, if it gets thicker than this and it's already starting to thicken up a little bit, add a little bit more milk. Make sure that when you're ready to put it in, it's this kind of consistency. Okay, let me check on the broth. So our broth is up to a boil. We want to have a nice, steady, rolling boil. Now we've got this nice, soupy batter here, not too soupy. And we start to drizzle this in slowly, okay? So we're going to drizzle this in. And what it ends up doing, if you're hitting the right temperature and the right consistency here, we're getting some little noodles. It's like making instant noodles as it boils. Now it's boiling again. Each time I put it in, it kind of slows it down. We also want to watch and not pour it right on top of noodles that are already forming. Okay, so I am battling this. It's going to be a lot easier. If you're in a modern kitchen, you can put this over your stove and you can get the temperature to really sit down and be right. Here, I've got to battle this fire. It's giant and then it's small. You kind of got to get a feel for exactly how much you want to put in, because obviously at some point you might have more batter than really what the broth will take. So you can't fill it all up with this stuff. But as you can see, it's making these little sort of, again, instant noodles. It's a great process. It's really fun. Okay, this is looking really good. It's basically cooked up. I let it kind of set a little bit longer with these guys cooking in there, but most of them are pretty small, so they are kind of instantly cooked. As soon as they kind of all come up to the surface, we know it's good. I just let this, basically boil for a minute or two more. Looks really good, so I'm gonna take it off the fire. There we go. It looks really good. It's smelling really good. It takes one last little ingredient here. I've got some butter. It's a big, nice spoonful of butter. And we're going to put the butter in there and let it melt. And let me stir this around just a hair. Now we can go ahead and serve this up into a bowl. This looks great. Let's go ahead and try this out. Well, here it is, and of course, we've got some wonderful beef brothy smell going on with this, and it looks fun. Maybe a little, I guess some people might look at it and say, oh, I don't know if that's going to be good, right? Well, we'll find out. Excellent soup with some really interesting texture because of our kind of noodles. And depending on, the water was boiling pretty furiously. And as you're pouring it in, depending on the consistency of your batter, it's either going to make big kind of noodles in there or small ones. And if the water's boiling too furiously, it's going to make really small ones. And if the batter's too thin, it'll make small ones. Such a great and wonderful recipe. And maybe if you're in this area, probably other areas of North America, you may already recognize this dish in modern cuisine as possibly under multiple names. The one I might know it by is Rivels. And the German word, Ingelhofen, I think is something like that. I tried to push it through some translation software, and I got run-in for the translation, or probably something like drizzle or pour in or something like that, which kind of makes sense. And so it is such an interesting recipe. It does show up in today's cookbooks, sometimes made a little bit differently than this, but this one is so easy, so fun, and right out of the 18th century German cookbooks. I really want to thank the folks down at Old Salem, it's in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, for working on this cookbook project. I think it's called, I don't think it's out yet, I don't think it's published, it's called The Raised Hearth. They're still working on getting that ready. And you can go down and make sure to check out their website. It's Old Salem in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. So I want to thank the folks down there. And I want to thank you for coming along as we savor the flavors and the aromas of the 18th century. Welcome to this episode. We have our friend and frequent guest, Michael Ragoo, and he's brought us this. I'm sure it's going to be a great recipe. What is it?
It's a fish pasty the Italian way.
This is going to be great. Thanks for joining us today. Okay, Michael, where is this particular recipe from?
I found this in the 1805 cookbook from Hannah Glass.
Okay, great. And you've done this lots, so you know exactly how this is going to go, right?
This is one of the episodes that I think we're going. I tried it once. It was an abysmal failure, and I think it's so obscurely written that I think we could use this as one of those. What the heck did she mean?
Okay, so we're going to figure out what the heck's going on here. You want to read it out?
I sure can. So here's what the recipe encompasses. Take some flour and knead it with oil. Take a slice of salmon, season it with pepper, salt, and dip into sweet oil. Chop an onion and parsley fine and strew over it. Lay it in the paste and double it up in the shape of a slice of salmon. Take a piece of white paper, oil it, and lay it under the pasty. Bake it, and that's it. It's best served cold.
So it says, I mean, the title again is Fish Pasty the Italian Way?
Right.
What do you think they mean by the Italian way?
When we were trying to research this, we found many modern references to in Italian cooking for pie doughs using oil and flour.
Okay.
They would introduce other things in addition to that, salts or
So
water,
probably
things like
the Italian way both has to do with olive oil being used on the fish and then the dough being maybe a more Italian
I would
paste.
say the Italian way is using oil with the flour.
Okay.
She only calls for flour and oil.
Okay.
Doesn't say quantities. In the modern recipes, I was finding a general proportion of a cup of flour to a quarter cup of oil.
And you tried it with just flour and oil, right?
I tried it with flour and oil.
And how did it work?
Well, it wasn't elastic at all. It was.
Okay.
Today we would just either add milk or water without thinking, and that may be something that should have been assumed.
Okay,
it just was assumed at the time. So, I'd recommend if you're going to do this at home to add a little water. Got 2 cups of flour.
Right. And is this just all-purpose flour here?
I used all-purpose flour because that's what I've got. This would be a gill or a half cup of oil. I'm going to sneak up on it.
Okay.
And when I tried this at home, it was feeling right. It just wasn't elastic. It was cracking. It was nice and soft, but it was just cracking. It clearly needed another ingredient. And honestly, so many of these recipes that we find when we try them, they just assume you knew what to do to get the thing started. And I have to start at face value just to, and then sneak up on it.
Works,
so this is what this is all about, just showing that it's okay if something doesn't turn out. You just have to keep sneaking up on it.
Okay, so you've got all the oil in.
Yes.
Time for a little bit of water?
I would put, once again, the recipe doesn't call for it, but I would put water in.
This is pretty
it's
pretty
not
crumbly. So
it's not behaving.
So really we're looking for just enough water to hold this together.
Yes, sir.
And keep it from cracking.
Keep it from cracking. It's the only difference to what I did in my test. I think we're all set.
Okay. Set that aside.
Yep, I think we're just going to sprinkle some flour on our table and roll this out.
Okay, there you go.
And I found that with the oil, it seemed to be very sticky, so I think we should oil or flour this thing as well.
Oh, you want me to do it? No, I'll let you do it.
That way, if there's catastrophic
Yeah,
failure,
if it fails, I don't
blame
want to
the
be in
host.
charge
That's
of it.
I think we're done. This is less than a 1/4 inch.
Okay.
Once again, she doesn't say what to shoot for. There we go, thank you.
Okay, so we've got this on
Oiled parchment. She says to
Oil
oil
paper.
paper, and so we oiled some paper.
Okay. I'm going to set this aside and we can work on
We're going to work on the salmon next.
Okay. Okay.
Alrighty, she says to apply salt and pepper to the fish and then immerse it in olive oil. When I did that, when I did my prep, I lost my salt and pepper.
Yeah.
So I'm going to oil it
We're
first.
going to reverse that.
Yeah,
Okay.
I am. Just Doesn't take much. Don't go nuts.
So a little bit of olive oil on both
Yep.
sides, and now we're just going to sprinkle.
We're gonna salt, pepper. My hands are yucky, so if you want to
Okay.
get salt around
Salt, both
and
sides.
pepper.
Pepper, lots of pepper.
Yep. Well, yeah. And some minced onion.
And you want that on top
Yep.
here too.
Yep, the whole thing. We're just gonna pack
And
that in.
parsley.
And parsley, yes, sir.
And probably, if we were doing this right, a little nutmeg too, right?
And we need more onion and
Oh, you need
parsley
more
over
onion and parsley on the other side.
Yep.
Okay.
there. Alrighty.
And there we go. That looks beautiful.
Yep.
And we're going to just put this in the middle, right?
We're just gonna put this on the side
Oh, yeah.
and wrap it around, wrap it over.
Okay.
It's just like a pocket sandwich. And we're just gonna pinch it around the edges.
And the directions actually say in the shape of the slice.
Well, yeah,
of
on the slice,
salmon.
yes. So we're just enveloping
Right.
the piece of flesh here. And we want to do a good job of pinching the edges of this
Okay.
because in her recipe, she says this should be eaten cold and it can be
Right.
stored up to a month. So this, I need to keep the steam in as this thing is baking. And also we just need to keep the air out. So
And if we have any little cracks, we want to patch those up so they're nice and tight.
She says bake it. She doesn't say how long.
Okay.
She doesn't say at what temperature. In my experimenting, 425 for 30 to 45 minutes got me a nice brown crust on the outside. And the thing is steaming on the inside. So
Okay, so I'll put this into a hot oven.
Yep.
And we will see what it turns out like.
very good.
So this, it looks beautiful. She actually references that these should be eaten cold, or
Yes.
they can be eaten cold.
Yep.
And that you can store them for quite a while. She says up to a month.
Up to a month,
I don't
yeah.
think we would do that today. But obviously, I don't, this looks elegant and beautiful. And in fact, we brushed the crust to make it brown up a little bit extra.
With some milk, right?
Yeah, there's just a little bit of milk on this to make it brown up beautifully.
Well, it's a pasties, a pocket sandwich.
Yeah.
We're from where I'm from. We're familiar with it in the Upper Peninsula, from Finland. So I'm guessing.
Should we? I guess we're just gonna pick this up
Yeah.
and eat it
give it a
because it's a pocket kind of food.
It's steamed in this thing. The onions released moisture.
You could definitely store this and not worry about it breaking up.
Yep.
If you carried this, in a pocket or something, it would hold up. But the crust is not. It's not a bad crust at all. Wonderful tasting. So this is a wonderful Hannah Glass recipe. Obviously, it's got an Italian take from at least in this English cooking. So
Yep.
it's an interesting recipe for that
Yep.
aspect. And I think these I think we definitely could maybe get a little bit more of those kind of Italian flavors, which I think she was trying to get at.
Well,
here.
and adding the oil when you're making the dough and having that be the main softening agent is what was interesting. And Kevin and I both had trouble researching period
Right.
recipes for the oil. We found modern Italian recipes for the oil
So
introduction. So
wonderful, wonderful flavors. A really interesting one, a different take. So I'm happy to see this one, especially a pocket sandwich with fish in it. That's a little interesting. So wonderful. Thank you, Michael.
Oh, sure.
So for bringing this up. And Michael, tell me about you've showed up on a different show here recently. Tell me a little bit about that.
Well, the manager of Martin Station, Billy Heck, had an opportunity to have an episode of Bizarre Foods with Andrew Zimmern filmed there. They were doing a Daniel Boone's Wilderness Trail episode, and I was allowed to participate. He asked me. I drove 8 hours to get there, and the only I had to use ingredients that they either brought with them when they came to that site to build the fort, or they could have found in the area. So I used local ingredients, and just had a great time. So.
Wonderful. We're here at Conner Prairie in Fishers, Indiana today, and Conner Prairie is a special place. Everything they do here is in first person. So this episode will be a little bit different. I'm gonna have to pretend like I'm in the 19th century. Here we go. Ma'am, I am so parched.
Ah, well, sir, you've come to the right place. This is the Golden Eagle Inn. I'm Martha Zimmerman. Who am I speaking to, sir?
I am Mr. Townsend. I am traveling up north, but I'm here preparing for this trip.
Well, it's a pleasure to meet you. Why don't you join me in our tap room here?
I would love to.
So, Mr. Townsend, I have something very special here.
Okay.
This is a beer that is very near and dear to my family. It's called Pennsylvania Swankey.
It sounds interesting. I don't think I've had Pennsylvania
I
Swankey.
don't think very many people outside of Pennsylvania have had it, sir. So I'll give you a small glass to start, and we'll see if you'd like more.
Certainly. Would you join me?
Oh, why, certainly I would.
Oh, yes. That is very refreshing. I don't know if I have those flavors right there. What is in this?
Well, it would be much easier to actually show you. In fact, I'm brewing today. And to defray the cost of the beer that I've just poured, if you'd like to help.
I'm very interested in being able to take beverages with me, and if I have to make my own, I have to.
Well, so why don't we go into the kitchen and we'll make some Pennsylvania Swankey right now.
That would be wonderful. I'll follow you.
All right. So we have most of what we need here to make Pennsylvania Swankey, which is what you tried. It's a recipe that my mutter and Oma, my mother and grandmother, made in Pennsylvania. And I suspect that not very many people drink it very much anymore, but I find it very refreshing.
I certainly did.
And what's unique about Swankey is that it's flavored with something very unique. It's flavored with star anise or star anise, and it is aniseed from the same.
It's from the same plant. Okay.
Yes, and so it gives a bit of a licorice flavor.
Oh yes,
and it tends to cool the mouth, and so it's very nice in the summertime. So what we'll do, if you wouldn't mind helping.
Oh, of course, of course.
Take about 5 or 6 of the star anise, and I would say most of the seed there that you have for the mortar and pestle, beat them, not savagely, sir.
Vigorously?
A kind beating.
Yeah.
A kind beating.
There we
just
are.
to break up. Yes, and just open that, the smell of the spice. Let me grab a good copper pot here, and I'll make just a gallon of Swankey at a time. It is a drunk green, so it doesn't last very long.
So it's not to be kegged up or...
No, sir.
Oh, I see.
So it is ready to drink in about 4 days, and it lasts 2 or 3.
Is that enough?
That looks very good.
Good.
To start with, we're going to put about 4 1/2 cups good sweet wheat bran.
Bran, yeah.
Yes. Now, and a lot of folks would tell you that wheat bran does not make good beer. It's not beer of the well-to-do, but it's perfectly drinkable for a small beer, which is what we're making today. So a small beer is for family consumption. I generally don't serve it to guests, but you were an exception today.
Thank you.
So about 4 1/2 cups of that bran, and then if you would add the spices there that you ground. Here we have hops that we grow here in our garden at the Golden Eagle Inn, and we want a good, generous handful. I like a bit of hop in my small beer.
Okay.
So truly, that is all that there is
To start this up.
to start this up. So what I'll do now is I'll get about, I've got some water boiling on the fire, and we'll pour about a gallon and a pint or so of water on top of this, and then set it to boil. So now we've got our mash that's been strained, and it has come to blood temperature.
So it's not hot anymore, yeah.
If you stick your finger in, it feels just a little warm.
Just barely.
But what we're going to do now is we're going to add some sugar syrup. Now, you can use molasses in exchange for this 1 cup, but the molasses tends to overpower, I think, that light taste of the star anise and the aniseed. And so what I've done here is I've made a sugar syrup using 3/4 of a cup of brown sugar and 1/4 of a cup of water. And just mix that until that sugar is dissolved.
So what do we need to get it to ferment?
Well, you need some yeast. So we've got some yeast here, and this is flaked yeast. So when we go to Indianapolis to pick up a beer that we serve to our guests in the tap room, we also get barm from the brewers. And so that's that top foam, that slurry that comes up as the beer ferments. And we take that, we can use it to rise bread, but we also dry it. We spread it out thinly on wooden spoons and we dry it in the sun. And then we flake that off and we can use that as our yeast.
Right.
And if you want to stir that up just a bit,
Sure.
and that will start to break down. And within 5 minutes or so, we
Really?
should start to see some activity here. So we'll let this set. I'm going to put a towel over the top of it, and we'll come back to it when it's a little happier.
So you set this aside. It's going to start percolating and brewing.
It will start fermenting within, as I said, 5 or 10 minutes, and then what we'll want to do is we'll put it in a jug and we'll bung it.
Yeah.
And you can tie your bung down if you want, because it may just pop off. But you shouldn't put it down too tight. Leave it loose just in case that fermentation does rise up above and it can flow over. After that sets for a couple of days, Swankey, like most small beers, should be drunk within 4 or 5 days, and ready to drink, I should say, and then consumed within 2 or 3 days. It tends to lose its fermentation, it's that effervescence after a few days. But the one thing that you want to do before you start to drink it, on that 4th or 5th day, you want to strain it through a cheesecloth. Because all of that activity that happened at the top as it fermented will eventually settle down to the bottom. And that's your emptins. And the wonderful thing about emptins, though, is that you can use it to make bread. In fact, I made this bread here using the emptins, and they look just a little bit like a gravy almost.
Bread and drink all in one.
Yes, sir.
And
Yes,
wonderful
sir.
flavors, and with all we would need from the store or difficulty getting would be, say, the hops, correct?
Yes, the hops could be a problem, and for you, if you're traveling, the spice may be a problem. If you are in the middle of nowhere, it'll be more difficult for you to give spice, but don't despair, because I know a receipt for a groot.
A
sir.
groot?
Have you had a groot before?
I don't know.
A groot is an unhopped ale, and it is flavored with herbs. So, in 1516, Reinheitsgebot, which is the German purity law, was declared. And what that meant was that beer could be made only with water, barley, and hops. And so really up until this point, people were brewing with all types of things. They were brewing with herbs and with fruits and with trees and everything that you can imagine. Because everything has yeast and sugar, and it will work if you treat it the right way.
It's got life in it.
Yes, sir, it does indeed. And so when this declaration was made, this purity law came into to being, it really changed beer making. And so a lot of these old ways, kvass and goza and groots, they went by the wayside. But my
We can make them today.
Yes, sir.
Yes.
My mutter and oma, my mother and grandmother, they brewed
Kept
these
those
types
ways?
of things. Yes, sir.
Uh-huh.
And when you met me in the garden earlier today, I was picking some alehoof, which is one of the ways. Alehoof. Creeping Charlie, cat's paw, coin plant, sir.
Really?
Goes by many names,
Yes.
and it grows almost everywhere in Indiana. So it's a wonderful thing to know what to do with and to brew with.
What do you do with it? How do you use it?
Well, let me show you.
Okay.
So here are some hops that you mentioned before, and these will be harder for you to find. And in fact, for us this year, we've had a blight on our hops, and so we've lost quite a few of our hops, or they've been eaten before we get a chance to harvest them, or they just haven't budded at all.
What is eating?
It's hard to know, and not knowing means that we can't really stop it from happening. So unfortunately, we have to make do, and that means that we have to brew another way. So that's where alehoof comes in.
So you would use this sort of as a direct substitute in exactly the same dried?
In fact, the same receipt. You use it fresh, as we made the Swankey, bran, and instead of the spice that you put in, the aniseed and the star anise, I would put in about a quart of fresh, washed, and picked alehoof. Now, I personally like to add a few sprigs of spearmint to it. I think it just gives a nice cooling effect to the alehoof. And I would put that in and simmer that with my water and bran until the bran drops to the bottom. And once it does that, then I would take it off and strain it through. Now, when you put it in a bowl to come to blood temperature, what you want to do, or what I like to do, in fact, is add about another pint of fresh ale hoof and another sprig of spearmint. Almost like you would steep a tea, tea leaves in tea, making tea, and that sort of adds to the flavor, I think. And then, just like we would do with the Swankey, we add either molasses or a sugar syrup and our yeast, and do the same. Jug it, bung it, and in 3 to 4 days, strain it and drink it. And again, the emptins from ale hoof can be used the same way that you use the emptins from Swankey to make bread, and it makes wonderful, good bread.
It seems so simple, and the Swankey was wonderful, refreshing.
Yes, indeed. Well, I think beer in and of itself is simple because it's important. It's healthful. It's good to drink. It's refreshing. It gives us energy in the morning to feel strong and gets us through our day. My eldest son likes to say that it's a bit like drinking his daily bread. And so I imagine that to some extent it is. And I think that these small beers, they taste very much like your kitchen, the yeast in your kitchen. And so I think it's a good analogy that he's made. So, Mr. Townsend, I happen to have just a little bit of Groot left, so why don't I pour you some?
I would love to try this.
So you'll see right away that the color is a little bit different because of the molasses instead of the brown sugar as the sweetener.
Certainly, what one would expect is a small beer. Good flavor, especially when it seems that it's just brewed up with some weeds or whatever you have around, I guess.
Well, I think that in this world today, we are very gifted in using what we have to make do. And I think that this is a receipt that's much older than I and much older than you. And so I think it speaks to how long people have been persevering with what they have.
Well, I'm certain that I will end up using this at some point, probably sooner rather than later, with what I hear is just absolute nothing where I'm going. So,
since you are traveling and you intend to be in such wilderness, I think it might be a good thing while you're in town to visit Mrs. Armstrong. She's a wonderful lady who lives just up the road, and she has lots of knowledge about plants and herbs and uses much beyond brewing.
Well, that sounds interesting because there is no medicine. I have heard of no doctor in the area. So that sounds like something I will definitely need. You'll definitely have to point me in her direction.
Well, I certainly will. But first, before you leave, let me give you some bread to get you started on your way so that you're not leaving with an empty belly.
Mrs. Zimmerman, thank you so much for this amazing information, the wonderful drink and everything. It will help me undoubtedly on my way up north and surviving up there. So I really want to thank you.
Well, you're very welcome. I'm always happy to meet a stranger.
You'll have to excuse me because I have to run and go see Mrs. Armstrong.
Safe travels.
What a wonderful episode, and it was a lot of fun. I really want to thank the folks here at Conner Prairie. They do such a tremendous job of welcoming us and presenting such amazing material. If you're ever in this sort of central Indiana area and you're interested in a historic site, definitely come and visit Conner Prairie. You will enjoy it. I want to thank you for coming along with us as we're experimenting. We're trying these things out. We're tasting these things and smelling these things. We're savoring the flavors and the aromas of the 18th and early 19th century. This episode has to do with medicines and herbs in the 19th century. Don't take what we talk about here today as medical advice, especially in the 21st century. We're talking about medicines in the 19th century, and it may or may not be, well, let's just pretend that it's not proper advice in the modern world. So there you go. Take everything you have here as a historical knowledge, not medical knowledge. Enjoyed this episode. We're here today at Conner Prairie in Fishers, Indiana. It's a wonderful early 19th century historic site, and we're in Prairie Town. Everything that's happening in Prairie Town with the staff members is in first person. That means that they are acting as if they are in the 19th century. So we're gonna have to do this episode a little bit differently than normal. I will actually be taking on that same kind of role. I'll be in the 19th century. So join me today as we experience Conner Prairie. Mrs. Armstrong?
Mr. Townsend, I presume.
Yes.
Yes, I heard that you were in town.
Yes, I've come to speak to you directly. Mrs. Zimmerman sent me over, and I am headed up north into the wilderness to look at a piece of ground, hopefully to settle up there. But they say there's nothing, no civilization
There isn't
whatsoever.
much at all.
And no doctors, no nothing. And I'm sure I'm going to need something medicinal. And they say, you're the person to talk to.
Well, I'm glad that you came.
What am I going to find?
Well, when you're up there and you've moved, if that's what you've chosen to do, of course you're going to be putting a garden in, so you'll have things that you'll be planting. But in the wild, you're going to find things like burdock. The leaf you can use for skin irritations, so as a poultice or a compress. Plantain, if you have been a bit, what would I say, a bit stopped up, and perhaps you have developed piles, it is a very good thing to use there. You've got chicory, which of course you're not going to have access to coffee beans, so you can use the root there for coffee. Wild cherry bark, which you can use for a bit of pain or coughs and colds. And of course the willow bark, which is one of the especially good ones for if you're having any pain in the knees, in the gut, in the head. That makes a very good tea. And then clover, coughs and colds, especially nice for that. And you're going to find that just about everywhere in an open field.
And how are most of these prepared? Do I need to do something more difficult?
Not difficult at all. Actually, most of them are going to be done either as a tea or a decoction. I don't think I would use any of those as a tincture or an elixir, but they certainly will work very nice. A poultice, a compress, you make a tea and then you soak a cloth and wipe over the skin, or you do something perhaps as I'm doing for my young grandson, John Marshall.
And these are all just found in the wild. I'll find them just scattered willy-nilly.
You will find them scattered willy-nilly, but you want to make certain that you're identifying them correctly.
So once I have a garden, then what do I need to take with me? What do I need to plant?
Oh, you're going to need to find seeds, and if you take those, Mr. Whitaker carries those down at the store, but I also have some seeds I can share with you. You'll definitely want to take a bit of yarrow. Yarrow is especially good for stopping the flow of blood, and I imagine that there will be a time that you'll cut yourself. Basil, especially nice. It's good to eat, but it's also very good to wipe on your skin to keep the bugs at bay. A very nice one too is the bee balm or monarda, just a good general purpose tea for good health. If you need to perhaps be a little bit invigorated, you want to do costumary. And
I've heard of costumary.
yes, my grandmother used to say, put it in your Bible, so when the minister was long-winded, you could chew it, it'll keep you awake. Sage is especially nice. It is a good tea for complaints of the throat and of the lungs. You've got feverfew, which it sounds odd because you would think it's good for fever, but it's especially good for headaches. It is very, very bitter though. So something such as honey, you're going to want to be able to add to that to sweeten it up quite a bit. All right, so in the wintertime when you're down in the dumps a bit, forlorn, your lemon balm is especially nice to make a tea. It helps to brighten your spirits a bit. It's good for anxiety. And I think those are probably the ones that I would recommend that you begin with. And one last thing that I think will be important to look for is the elderberry bush. The elderberries are wonderful to use in a tincture. So that's where you will cover them over with a spirituous liquor of some sorts.
Yes.
And of course it can be awfully strong. I don't know if you have any young'uns. So I would put it into a bit of tea and perhaps add a bit of honey to get them to take that.
And good for?
Oh, colds, influenza. Sinus, yes, very good for all of those things.
So these seem easy enough to procure in that area, possibly. I hope so. What about the preparations?
Preparation really isn't difficult at all. Things such as jewelweed I have used to make a tea, and it's a very strong tea, as you can see from the color that's here. Jewelweed I like to use as a tea for rashes, especially poison ivy. And I imagine you'll find
To
plenty
drink?
of that. Not to drink. That's a good question. It is more of a compress, so that you're going to soak a cloth in it and wipe it onto the skin, or even wrap it around the skin. It helps to cool and keep the irritation or the itch at bay. Then the one I'm working on here now is actually a poultice, and what I've done is I've put the mullein leaf that you can see here, and feel that. You will probably find that one. It is also known as a hag's torch, or mullein is just what I've always known it as.
I think I've seen this referred to as Indian tobacco.
Perhaps you have. Perhaps you have, because oftentimes it is taken as a smoke for lungs. Yes. But I also like to, with the young grandson, the yellow flowers that develop on the stalk.
Yeah.
I put those in oil. I shake that every day for about 4 weeks. I strain it, and it is good at keeping earaches settled. So they're not so irritating. What I've done though here is I've taken this, I've added a bit of salt to help break it up, and a bit of vinegar. And it is going to be a poultice that I'll put in. He has developed a bit of rash as a result of his nappy, or his napkin, and with the heat that we've had. So I will put that against the skin on his hind end, and then wrap him up, and that shall help to take care of the irritation. Skin. And then if you had a wound or a cut and you're out, and since you're going to be where there isn't anything handy, then you just simply put that over and wrap that down with a cloth or something of that sort, and it'll help keep the wound much
So that
cleaner
seems
and
simple.
help to heal. So an easy one to do. And you can even do that by chewing if you so chose to do so. Plantain has so many, many uses. The leaf is good that if you're out and you have been bitten by a bug or bitten by a mosquito of sorts, you chew that up, even a bee sting it'll work on. And you take that and put it right directly on that sting or that bug bite, and it'll take that sting and irritation away. But I like to take it and make it into an oil. So I've put that into a jar that I covered over with sweet oil. And then I let that set for about, I would say, it was a good 4 weeks. And I would shake it every day. And then I've strained it. So by putting this, 4 parts of the oil to 1 part of beeswax, it'll make a very good salve that I'll be able to use any time that I need it for a skin irritation, or again, for a bite, an insect bite of some sort. Many of the receipt books that we're looking at have medicines that Dr. Campbell would use. So they're not necessarily ones that you're going to find growing wild, which is what you're looking for. So it's one of those things that you're going to need to look at some books such as the ones that I've listed here.
Now, this one I believe I've seen in the library. Culpepper's herbal.
Yes. It is a very, very old book, but it's still being used. Ladies oftentimes refer back to it, but oftentimes you can't get access to that book, so you'll share what you know, Mrs. Zimmerman, perhaps. Well, Mr. Townsend, I am going to be making a salve here in a little bit, and perhaps you'd like to stay to see, since that's the one that seems most confusing.
I would like to experience that.
And then, when it is time for you to leave, I'll send you on your way with some seeds for your new garden.
That would be so kind.
Good. All right, to begin, I'm going to start by putting a little bit of the beeswax into this little pot that's sitting into a small little spider where it's been filled with water. That way I'm going to use it to melt the beeswax, but not to burn it. Right, it is ready now. I've got the beeswax melted, so into that I'm going to add the 3 parts of the plantain oil.
Yes.
Because I'm also going to add 1 part of the lavender oil. Now that's not one that you're going to find in the wild, but that's one that you'll have in your garden eventually. So you've got the plantain, which is good for the skin, and you've got the lavender, which is good for healing.
And these oils were just simply prepared by putting those green herbs into the oils and letting them sort of percolate for weeks at a time.
In the
and
sun.
then strained out in the
And
sun.
shaking on a daily basis.
Okay, so-
But then you want to make certain that you strain it to keep it longer than that.
So it's a fairly simple compound.
The final compound is 1 part of beeswax to 4 parts of oil, and it can be any combination of oils that you choose based upon what ingredients that you need for what purpose.
What you need. Wonderful. That's so simple.
It is very simple.
So, where do you store this in something?
Just a small tin, I'll pour that into there just before it starts to set up, and then it will set up and be just fine to use indefinitely.
On anything you need.
On any part of the body, skin-wise, where you're having an irritation of some sort, or a small cut or wound.
That's so helpful. Thank you.
You're very welcome.
Hopefully, I'll be able to find what I need up there.
Well, and now that we have it all finished, I did promise you that I would send you on your way with seeds. So let me get some of those out. And I don't know which way you're heading, but I think if you keep these up tight, they'll last you until you get there.
I'll take the. Thank you so much
You're very
for this,
welcome.
and I am headed up north. Thank
And
you.
keep your eyes open.
I will. Thank you so much. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this very different and very special episode here at Conner Prairie. It's, again, a wonderful site to visit. So if you're ever in this area, this sort of Midwest area, and you get a chance to come by, an especially wonderful place to visit. So make sure to come to Conner Prairie. And I want to thank you for coming along as we experiment and try these things out, as we learn new things. Thanks for joining us today. In this episode today, we're looking at the differences between a kitchen like this, an 18th century kitchen, and a modern kitchen today. Thanks for joining us. So there are 4 or 5 sort of major components to a kitchen, at least a kitchen we think of today. Probably the main one is the heating part, the stove, the oven. Let's go take a look at our stove or oven, or our hearth. So here's the hearth that we've got here in the kitchen set. And this hearth is actually based on a German hearth at the Frontier Culture Museum in Staunton, Virginia. They've got a German house there, and there's a hearth very similar to this. It's a little bit lower, but that's what we based this particular hearth on. This hearth has a fire brick cooking surface, and we've got an oven that's built into the wall here. And this is the stovetop of the 21st century. Now, of course, we have to cook with wood, or possibly at times charcoal, but those are our only cooking fuels that we can use. Of course, today we're using gas or electricity almost all the time. And that's one of the giant differences here between the 18th century and the 21st century. Cooking over a fire, cooking with either charcoal, which is a little bit easier, or wood, it's a constant battle to keep a regular heat going on underneath your cooking surface. So many times we want to have this very controllable heat surface, and we don't have that in the 18th century. We've got to be fussing with this continuously, as opposed to just turning a knob and setting it to 3, or taking a look at your flame and getting just the right temperature. Very, very difficult in the 18th century. And you just can't leave something alone. You have to be messing with it all the time. And over here we've got the oven, and we have actually a real similar problem with an oven. I mean, if you go and use your oven today, you set it to 350 degrees or whatever the equivalent is where you're at. You just set that knob and it takes care of the whole thing, right? Sometimes you might even have a timer, and you can say, yes, cook it for exactly 1 hour. And one of the giant differences between an 18th century oven and that is that in an 18th century oven, you stoke your oven full of wood, and you spend maybe an hour, 2, maybe even 3 hours getting your oven up to temperature. And when you think it's the right temperature, you pull all that fuel out, and you set it aside, and then you put the thing you want to cook in there, you close the door, and what's happening? It's not keeping the same temperature, but the temperature is slowly declining over time. And it totally depends on your oven as to exactly how quickly that happens. And that is a real battle, and one of the differences between baking in the 18th century and modern. It completely changes what's going on, your starting temperature and your ending temperature. So there's a big difference in baking between the 18th and 21st century. The other thing that's going on here is I built this as a German hearth on purpose, up high, at this level, basically to make it very easy. Both it's authentic, but it's also a lot easier to do an episode, a cooking episode with video. So I can cook right here at this height and you can see it very easily. But if you look at many of our other videos where we are on site at other 18th century kitchens or style kitchens, you'll find that almost all of them have their hearth on the ground. You have to lean all the way down and cook on the floor, basically. It's very difficult to shoot a video like that, and it's no easier to do your cooking like that either. It's very, very difficult, and you can see from some of our other videos how much trouble it is to do that. I also want to point out the smoke hood that we've got here. In the 18th century, of course, we're burning wood, we're burning it inside, and we have this constant battle of smoke in the kitchen. And you might think that from the videos that we don't have any problem with having smoke in the kitchen, but contrary to that, we have smoke problems all the time. Unless the draft is just right, the door is open, the window's open just right, the room fills with smoke. And it's also true not only in this kitchen set, but in other situations. Other 18th century kitchens have that same sort of problem. You have to have a lot of draft to keep smoke out of the room, and they had the same kind of problem in the 18th century. Some kitchens probably benefited from just the right chimney, just the right draft. They didn't have smoke problems. But I'm imagining the majority of them did have smoke problems. And that's another one of the great things about a modern kitchen is that the fuels we use, electricity especially, but gas also, the fuels don't leave a taste in the food itself. In the 18th century, you were always having this wood smoke flavor going into your food. And you might think that's great for 1 or 2 dishes, but every single thing you eat, it gets boring after a while, and you'll see references to cooks in the 18th century trying to keep that smoky flavor out of their food. That's another battle from the 18th century. So next on the tour here is what are we going to do for cabinetry and shelving and storage? And there are 2 different kinds of storage, maybe 3 different kinds of storage that we would think about, both storage of equipment and then storage of food itself. So storage of equipment in the 18th century kitchen, they probably didn't have as much equipment lying around as we do, unless it was a very affluent kitchen. Most of the kitchens that you see in pictures, no, they tend to be affluent kitchens, so they tend to be fairly well equipped, but I would imagine most 18th century kitchens have not that many cooking implements lying around. And you don't, in the picture, see that much storage of this equipment. Many things are hanging on the wall, and you do see a few shelves, like the shelf behind me, and a few kind of cabinets that you see like this. Nothing like the cabinets that we have today. Of course, our kitchens are lined with cabinets that are both full of food, we use them like pantries, and full of equipment. But you can see here the kinds of things that we have in our cabinet here. If you look at most of these, you'll see I've got a lot of them turned upside down, and that's another one of the major differences. I hope there's a difference here. So many of these 18th century kitchens, they're overrun with rodents. There's always, where there's food in the 18th century, they have pest problems. Rodents and other kinds of insect problems in their kitchen. So many times you'll see all the bowls and things turned upside down because that way if rodents are running around your things, they don't get inside of them and then mess them up, okay? So if they're upside down, that doesn't seem to happen so much. And here's the other thing you don't see in these 18th century kitchens is there's nothing like a refrigerator. You do find at times in the 18th century for food storage, especially cold food storage, you'll find things in a cellar, which we don't see very many pictures of, but they definitely stored some of their food things down in the cellar where it was cooler and hopefully drier. They also had spring houses where they would put, especially dairy kinds of things, to keep them cool, but they just didn't have anything like a refrigerator. Most of the time when you see food stored in an 18th century kitchen, hey, it's just hanging up on the wall. Maybe it's getting smoked up in the chimney, or it's actually sometimes getting smoked up just in the upper parts of the kitchen. You'll see some pictures with that where they might store cheeses or bread or even meat in their kitchen. And well, I don't know how it exactly turned out, but that was one of the only ways they had to really store food. So it's basically right out there in the open. And everything else, you had to eat it up right away or it was gonna go bad within a day or so. Another one of these major components are work surfaces in the 18th century kitchen. And you know, most of the time we've got islands in the middle of our kitchen. We've got all this countertop space. You really don't find too much of that in the 18th century. We do have a little bit of countertop space, and we've got the large working surface, the big kitchen table that's in the middle of the kitchen. Now, this work surface is actually made specifically for making videos, so it's a little bit higher so that you can see what we're doing here a little bit better. But in most of these 18th century kitchens, you do see a fairly large and low table in the middle to do all that cooking work in your kitchen. So what's really missing here? I mean, if you think about your kitchen at home, it's like, okay, we don't have a refrigerator, that's right. But we do have a cooking surface, or a cooking surface. We do have a working surface. We do have some storage of things. But the big thing that's missing in this 18th century kitchen is, where's the sink, where's the water? And that is one of these major advantages that we have over these folks that are in the 18th century. They have no water except what they bring in pails and buckets, and no real place to get rid of it. So doing the dishes or just having water to work with is much more difficult in the 18th century. If you think about it, we have this tremendous advantage of not only having water, but water under pressure at both hot and cold. And not only that, but the water goes away. And we have this sink and it's got a drain and it all goes away immediately. They have none of that in the 18th century. They might at times have possibly a pump on the inside so they can just get regular cold water and hand pump it into a situation. Very rarely do you see that. It's fairly rare. But that's one of these things. Doing the dishes in the 18th century was so much more difficult. You can imagine bringing in the water by hand, heating it up over the fire so you have it at least, you know, somewhat tepid. Then it's always getting cold again. You're having to fight that, and getting the dishes done must have been just so difficult. And I can't even imagine it myself. When we cook in here, we make a mountain of dishes, and then I have to take them all inside to my house and wash them up the regular way, because I don't want to have to, you know, wash dishes in the 18th century method. And we do have a video talking a little bit about cleaning up and doing the dishes in the 18th century. Much more difficult. And another one of these advantages that we might not recognize is just simply having artificial light in our kitchens. In the 18th century, you had the light from the fire, and you had the light from the windows, probably an open door just so you could get a draft and not fill your room with smoke. And if you're cooking early in the morning, which you know happened all the time before the sun came up, all you had was a little bit of candlelight or a simple oil lamp to light your way around the kitchen. It is so difficult to cook in the dark, and you know that they had so much difficulty with that. And today, we just flip on the light. We've got a great episode today. This one is called Beggar's Pudding. It's a great way to use up your stale bread. Thanks for joining us. So let's go back to the 18th century for just a moment and think about food waste and issues with items like bread. Even today, we may buy a lot of bread for a particular situation, an event or something, and then it doesn't happen, and so we end up with all this bread that it goes bad. Or, you know, it may just happen in a normal household over time. In the 18th century, food did not go to waste. You didn't want to waste your food, and so they had ways to deal with things like stale bread. Maybe you bought stale bread from the baker because he overbaked. Maybe you had stale bread in your household, but they had several different kinds of recipes that use stale bread. This one, this Beggar's pudding, uses stale bread as the main component, so we can use that today. This particular recipe is from the Universal Cook, and it's a cookbook that was done in 1773 by John Townsend, which I thought was pretty funny. He uses a couple extra H's, but I don't. But he obviously has this great recipe. Let's get started. So let's talk about our ingredients. I've got them all set out here. Obviously, we've got our stale bread, and if you've got something nice and tough, if you don't have stale bread already, well, you'll have to leave it out and get it stale, maybe, because it does need to have some good hard texture to it. That'll make it a little bit easier to do this. Also, for another ingredient, we need hot water. So you're gonna need hot water. This might be a little less than we need, but you know, a good 16, 20, 24 ounces of hot water. Doesn't have to be boiling. We've got ground ginger here. We also have, of course, salt. And you, of course, can't do one of these recipes without having some wonderful nutmeg to add to the flavor of this pudding. To add to the liquids, we also have some sack wine, which is like a sherry from the time period. It's a fortified wine. And there's a nice little sack wine piece that we've got in another video. I'll put a link down in the comment section below, or in the description section. We also have some currants in this particular recipe, and these currants, we're going to use Zante currants, or the tiny little grape raisins is basically what they are. In the time period, some of these recipes referenced currants that were like black currants that were ribes, and other times they're talking about the raisin kind of currant. We're going to go with the raisin kind of currant in this particular recipe. We also need some sugar. It calls for Lisbon sugar. In this situation, I'm just going to use just white loaf sugar. And we're going to need some butter towards the end here to butter our dish and to put some butter on top as it's baking. Let's start mixing up the materials we need. So step one here is the bread. We need to break it into pieces that's gonna work with this. And after that, you can either slice it up, you know, whatever way breaks up the bread most easily. And now we're gonna pour hot water over the top of this bread. And I'm gonna let this kind of soak up just for a second while I mix up the other ingredients. I'm gonna just mix everything here in the currants bowl. There aren't a lot of other ingredients, at least they don't take up a lot of room necessarily. I've got probably 6 ounces of currants here. What is that, about a half a cup or so, more or less. There are no measurements in this recipe. Like so many of them, it's just sort of a guideline. There is no, there's no particular amount of bread or any of these other ingredients mentioned. And many times in these recipes, even when they do mention one thing as a particular sort of quantity, none of the other ones are measured, so you're still guessing, no matter what you do. I've got ground ginger, and ground ginger is one of these things, it's very, very popular in the 18th century. Obviously, we're gonna need some nutmeg. I've got some salt here, it's a little bit coarse. And next up is the sack that we're gonna put in here. And this is about a gill of sack. Again, totally guessing. And the last ingredient that needs to go in is sugar. And I've got some white sugar here. I'll just bust up into this. So we're probably at about 1/4 of a cup of sugar. Obviously, depending on how sweet you want this and how big your dish is, you can adjust that quantity. I'm gonna go ahead and continue to break up this sugar with our liquids. We're gonna go back to our bread. Now that we've got that mixture, it's soaked a little bit, and now we can kind of come back in here and look at it. We can kind of mush it up. It calls for squeezing out any extra liquid, so we really have to feel about whether we put too much water in or not. And this texture feels pretty good, pretty doughy, not like we could squeeze a bunch of water out of it if we tried. And you definitely kind of have to leave it a little bit, or else it won't soften up. But since we need to mix these other ingredients, and that's what it definitely calls for in this recipe, it says You need to mix the other ingredients well with that. That means this has to be broken down to a certain extent so we can get it all mixed in properly. Okay, so now that that feels good, let's bring our currants and wine and all those spices together now, and the sugar. We can just thoroughly mix these things up. Now we can get our pie pan ready. It doesn't call for the exact item that we're gonna bake this in. I mean, in theory, you could even boil a pudding like this, but I'm not sure how that would turn out. But this one is a baked pudding. Let's get this dish all buttered up. Now we can put our mixture straight into that. He actually calls for smoothing the top of this with a spoon, but I found that my hand works just as well, if not better. And if it's already messy, why not? You definitely have a choice here. Depending on your bread, you might want to leave this crust on like I did in part of this, or take the crust off. This will change the texture and the taste a little bit, depending on the kind of bread that you're going to be using. Last up in this recipe is to put some butter up on top. Again, I don't think he wants this drying out, and this goes into the oven. I think it calls for a slack oven. We're not to bake this really high at a real high temperature. I would guess, I've tried this one in 325 or so. You can pop this into the oven, and time-wise, about 35 minutes, maybe 45 minutes, depending on the size of your dish and the thickness of it. Let's get this one in the oven. Well, here's our Beggar's pudding, and it turned out good. It smells great coming out of the oven. And it did sprinkle a little bit of sugar on this thing, and it looks good. It's got some nice currants, nice color to it. It definitely held up in the oven. And let's find out what it tastes like. It's got a wonderful bread pudding-y kind of texture. This is real similar. It's a kind of bread pudding, but it doesn't have what bread puddings typically have in them, milk or eggs. It's a kind of a simplistic version in some ways, in that it just has hot water that goes in with the bread. But the currants are a nice mix. The currants don't have to be there. This would still be great without it. We get the impression from the name Beggar's Pudding that, possibly this was at times a dish for folks that didn't have a lot of money, but all they had was stale bread, right? And you could see how you could simplify this recipe and take out some of the expensive ingredients and still have something that was tasty and a great way to turn your lemons into lemonade, as it were. Wonderful flavors. You get that, of course, that ginger in here, which was one of the lesser expensive spices, but it comes in here wonderfully. Of course, we got nutmeg, and this recipe is really, it's different than most of what we cook today. So it is this wonderful way to experience these recipes, these wonderful food items right out of the 18th century. We get to test them out, we get to taste them, we get to smell them. Such a wonderful way to experience history and to share it with other people if you have that. If you have that thing, I'm gonna bake this and invite people over because it's something a little out of the ordinary. Wonderful dish. You can do this at an event. If you're doing it in a Dutch oven, you can do it at home. Great, wonderful, simple ingredients. You're gonna like this one. You should really try it out. We're here again with Michael Ragoo, a friend and a frequent guest, and we're doing, what is it?
It's a turnip ragu.
Turnip Ragoo? This one ought to be fun. Thanks for joining us today. So a ragu of turnips, where is this one from?
Well, I got it from Mary Randolph's cookbook. She wrote it in 1824, but it was a collection of her family's recipes, and that's mid to late 1700s into early 1800s.
Right, and it's the Virginia Housewife.
Virginia Housewife,
If you want to look that one up, Mary Randolph, the Virginia Housewife, a great little cookbook, early 19th century American kind of cookery.
Yes.
It's one of the good early American cookbooks. How do we get started with this one?
We're just going to peel and thinly slice your turnips.
Okay, so before we even get started with the cooking portion of this, we are cooking over charcoal right here in the kitchen. But remember, in an 18th century kitchen, the windows are open, the doors open, we've got a chimney close by. You can't do this at home, obviously, but we can because we're in an 18th century kitchen. So at home, use your regular stove. Okay, Michael, what are we doing here?
I'm just be generous, but we're gonna fry up our turnips, thinly sliced and peeled turnips in butter. I'll get some oil between them so they don't stick together. This is just a simmer, not high, not low. Just I'm trying to cook them through, and I'm trying to get them just a little brown.
So she calls for these to be cooked in butter, but there's one more ingredient here, right?
Once we have gotten these so they're just starting to brown, we're going to introduce some sugar.
So the sugar part is really interesting. I mean, typically for a savory dish today, we wouldn't add sugar to it, but that's I mean, she calls for it. She says a little bit of sugar in this recipe. So that's what we're gonna do.
It's the only time I've run across adding sugar to a vegetable dish.
So this looks all hot. What's next?
What's next is I'm going to introduce, she asks that we introduce a good or a rich gravy, a highly seasoned gravy.
Gotcha.
That's it for now. We're going to add some when we serve it up. We'll add some more on top.
And quickly, what is in this particular gravy you've done?
She uses mutton, beef, pork, bacon, anything that you've got meat-wise, bones, anything. You're just going to reduce that down almost like you were making a soup or a stew, and then you start adding veggies. I've got onion, some of the turnip, some mushrooms. I've got carrot in here. I have celery in here. I've got a chicken stock I had left over I put in, and I put a little red wine in. So that's
and
pretty
the
much
kitchen sink and everything else.
Well, allspice, you can get too much, but the only seasoning I have is salt, pepper, and some allspice. That's it. Otherwise, it's the basics that I had in the fridge.
Is this ready to go?
It is. It's ready to serve up.
Okay. Well, it looks really good. I suppose we should try this out.
Anything with gravy is good, and this is good gravy.
Well, we're going to find out. Well, the gravy's killer, obviously. I mean, you could probably put that gravy on anything. There's definitely a sweetness, and I'm wondering whether some of the sweetness is there from the turnips anyway.
It might be. It masks that these could have been cooked carrots after all this happened.
Right.
It's just a medium to hold the gravy,
but
I don't taste turnip at all.
Tremendous.
Yeah.
Although I think I'm missing a note.
What is the note you're missing?
I think it could use just...
Oh, no, don't say it.
Again, thank you,
No problem,
Michael, for this particular recipe. I could eat this again all day if I wanted to. It is really, really good. And I really want to thank everyone out there for your amazing support.
Yeah. As a matter of fact, I just want to say, because of the comments, it's made me a better demonstrator. This is a worldwide medium. We're not just talking to where we are located. And the observations from different countries about what they have done, they remember what their parents did or their grandparents, observations that we think we're as complete as we can be each time, but we've missed the points entirely sometimes. There's a whole nother objective, and it just has made me a better presenter when I'm doing this reenacting thing in the field to have read the comments and learned from them. So I thank you for that, too.
Yeah, we are so grateful for the amazing comments. Michael and I and everyone in the crew, it's just like we really want to thank you for the support that you give us. Whether it's watching the videos, you're sharing the videos, commenting on the videos, all those things mean so much to us. So I really want to thank you for that. And I want to thank you for coming along with us today as we savor the flavors and the aromas of the 18th century. Welcome to 18th Century Cooking. Today we're doing another Hannah Glass recipe. This one is special. This one's going to be good. It's called to fried beef steaks. Thanks for joining us today. So let's get started on these fried steaks. Now she calls immediately for rump steaks. In North America, that term now we use the term sirloin. So you may still use rump steak over in the UK, but we call these sirloin steaks. So I got a couple sirloin steaks, and she says, beat these well with a roller. So we're gonna flatten these guys out. now it's time to fry these up. We're supposed to fry these up in a half a pint of a not bitter ale. And there we go. So I'm gonna keep my eye on these. They're gonna kind of simmer fry up here, and we've got some other pieces that we need to work on at the table. So now she calls for this sort of set of spices to be rolled in butter and flour. We've got salt. I'm just gonna make a little pile here on the plate. Salt, we've got some pepper, and nutmeg, of course, that's in this recipe. And a little bit of thyme and parsley. And then she says, roll that butter around in this spice mix to pick these spices up. And once you've done that, and I think that looks pretty good, that needs to be rolled into flour. So we're gonna roll that into flour after the spices. Now our ball of butter is all prepared. I also have an onion that's chopped nice and small. I'm gonna go check on these steaks. If they're ready, then these will go into the pan along with them. She calls for shaking these up together in the pan until the steaks are nice and tender. The sauce has thickened up. This is looking really good, so this is ready to serve. Wow, this one smells good. Let me tell you a secret. I made this last night. I know it's really, really good. Hannah Glass did an excellent job with this particular recipe, so I'm gonna love this one. Let's find out exactly how this one turned out. There we go. Whoa, whoa. Tremendous flavors. I mean, really, really. The spices in here, you can taste that thyme in there, and the roux that was made up by that butter and the flour that came in at the end. And again, we didn't, those basically came in at the end, so they didn't get cooked out. The ale, the steak cooked in the ale gives it really a very different flavor, which I really enjoy. And this thick gravy that's made right up in it, so very good. If you get a chance to make this one at home, I guarantee you'll enjoy this one. It is excellent. In this episode, we're doing a simple recipe, but I believe it's going to be very delicious. This one's right out of Amelia Simmons' American Cookery Cookbook, Roast Beef. So technically, this is the first recipe in this recipe book. Everything else is before it is instructional about how to choose foods. But recipe number 1 is to roast beef. Let me read this to you. It's pretty simple. The general rules are to have a brisk hot fire, to hang down rather than to spit, to baste with salt and water, and 1/4 of an hour to every pound of beef. Though tender beef will require less time, while old tough beef will require more roasting. Pricking with a fork will determine whether it's done or not. Rare done is the healthiest and the taste of this age. Now, I thought this recipe is very interesting. If you check a lot of recipe books, especially the English recipe books in the 18th century, not that many of them actually have roast beef recipes. Most of the time, it's either roasting other meats or doing different things with beef. Now, either that's because roast beef was so common that they didn't think that you needed directions, or the beef of that time period was too tough to roast. I'm not sure which one is true. I'm guessing the latter rather than the former, but we'll find out. I've got a simple sort of round roast here, and we're gonna try roasting it over the open fire. So she calls for hanging this, not putting it on a spit. So I'm gonna go ahead and tie this up with some cordage I've got here. I want to make sure that in the end, this fat cap ends up on top, at least at the beginning of the cooking process, so the fats go down through the meat and we don't lose that. So we want to make sure that this ends up on top. Okay, so that looks like that's going to hang really well like that. So let me get this knot kind of tied off. As long as our cord doesn't burn through, we'll be doing great. Let's go ahead and rig this up by the fire. Okay, you can see I've already set up the hearth kind of special with this. I thought I would try to decrease the cooking time a little bit by bringing in the reflector oven. Now this reflector oven is made to work with a spit, but I'm going to experiment, see if I can get it to work with the hanging piece of meat here. I've tilted it up with a couple of fire bricks up in front, kind of tilt it up a little bit, and so I can hang the meat down in front and still catch the drippings, but it reflects this heat, so we don't lose all that backside heat. And I'll probably have to experiment with the fire a little bit. Here you can see, let's go ahead and hang this and get it started. So here is our piece of beef here, and hopefully I'll continue to experiment and get that just right. There we go. Now she calls for a high brisk fire, and that's why I brought this fire. You can see I've kind of raised it up on top of fire bricks so that not all of the heat kind of goes in from the bottom, but we're kind of trying to get some side heat on this. So we actually, every kind of fireplace or every kind of open fire pit, you're gonna have to do your own little experimenting about how you can get this fire to not be basically underneath it, but get the meat beside this. So I'll continue to experiment with this, and I also have to be ready as this starts to cook up to baste it with basically salt water, what she calls for. So water and salt. Now some of those earlier English ones have some other bastings that come into this when you roast beef in this manner, but those kind of fancy bastings come in at the very end of the cooking. So, and this one's just very simple. It's just salt and water. So that's what we're going to get going with this. So we want to come back to this every so often. This isn't something you really want to leave go too much all by itself, but we want to stay here. We want to, keep it spinning every minute or so. We come in here and spin this if we need to. We can, pick this up, change the loop around so that the other side kind of stays if we're not going to spin it a lot, and continue to tend the fire so that we have a nice, clear, bright flames that are sort of beside it. Again, that's what we're trying to. And of course, we have to keep basting this thing too. We don't want it to dry out. So it isn't something that you leave behind. In fact, if you look at the paintings, sometimes there'll be a little boy by the fire who's continuing to either crank the spit or, tend these things as they're cooking. So they almost always have somebody that's continually tending these. Again, remember the timing on this. She said that's about 15 minutes per pound. This guy is running, I don't know, probably 2.5, 3 pounds. So it should take half hour, 45 minutes. We might shrink the time by having this reflector oven. As thick as I'm thinking this piece of meat is, I'm worried that it's going to take a little longer. So, we'll just see how it turns out. I mean, again, this is an experiment. I've never done one quite like this, so I'll cook it until I feel like it's done. Okay, well, let's see how this has done. I have been, looks like about an hour and a half cooking this. It's taken a lot longer. Actually, I think I was too far away from the fire at the beginning, so it took a lot longer. Although if you read some of the other directions, like Hannah Glass, she says to start out farther away from the fire. Then when it starts to look done, you bring it closer and speed up the cooking, which is exactly what I ended up doing, maybe by accident, but that's what I ended up doing. Amelia Simmons says to try this out by putting a fork into the flesh and seeing what kind of fluids come out. She doesn't, go into a whole lot of detail, but, when I press the fork deep into the center of this, I'm getting mostly clear fluid. So I think we're doing pretty good. Still might be a little, probably pretty rare in the middle, but of course, Amelia Simmons says that's the healthiest and the taste of the age. So I think I'm going to go ahead and slice a piece off of this, see how it turns out. Wow, you know, you could start to tell when this was getting done, when the, you know, it really comes up with the smell that you're, you know, really salivating for. And this really turned out well. It looks so wonderful. It smells great. You know, I cut into it and it's still, you know, a little rare in the middle, but nice and cooked. It's still a little pink. For a nice big piece of meat like that, I think that turned out pretty much perfect. I couldn't have done it, I couldn't have guessed any better. So it's time to try this out. And I went ahead and put a little mushroom ketchup on it just because, I mean, that's the thing for these kinds of things, mushroom ketchup. Although I probably didn't need to. This was going to be so good without it. But I had to do it because mushroom ketchup is so great. So let me cut up a little bit here and we'll try it out. Amazing texture and wonderful smoky flavor along with the mushroom ketchup. Just excellent. Just like you really expect it to be, with this wonderful roast beef over the open fire, you know, hung and spun and basted with the salt water. Wonderful flavors. If you get a chance to do an open fire roast beef like this, especially at an event where you can kind of watch it and keep it going, take some time with it. You know, don't try to cook it too fast. It's one of those things you really just have to give it a lot of time. And wow, just so wonderful, excellent flavors. Everyone will talk about this for, you know, months to come if you make one of these at an event or even at home for that matter. Such wonderful flavors. And right out of Amelia Simmons's cookbook, 1796, that's an American cookbook. She does quick, simple, easy directions for this, and turned out great. There are more complex ones if you go back and look at the English cookbooks, and they get all fancy, but Amelia Simmons is like, no, it's not that tough. Let's do it simple. In this episode, we're going to be making a wonderful root soup out of a translated 18th century German cookbook. Thanks for joining us today. The recipe that this comes from is actually from an 18th century German cookbook. The folks down at Old Salem, which is in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, they're working on translating these for this sort of setting, for living history. And they've given us a sort of pre-published version of this book. So that's what we're working from on this one. This one is a root soup. Sounds really good. Let's get started. So let's talk about ingredients. This recipe calls for roots because it's a root soup, and there's something a little different here. Celery root is what it calls for. Celery root, maybe celeriac is what we would use. I was unable to get some celeriac, so we're using what we've got here today. Also carrots, that's easy enough, and parsley root, which is not something you typically see, but that's closely related to parsnips, so that's what we've got here. We've got parsnip, we've got carrot, and our other root that we're going to sub in here is a turnip. And the recipe calls for cutting these down into little slivers. It actually talks about cutting them into match-like length and size, a thick match. Our vegetables are all cut up here into their little pieces. Now it's time to saute this in a little bit of butter. It calls for sauteing these, but not totally. So it says something like not until golden. I think we don't want to get these too soft in this state. We want these to still hold together in the soup. If this isn't, you know, pureed vegetable soup or pureed root soup, we want to still have some pieces in there. So our vegetables are cooked in our butter. It's time to get this starting to turn into a soup here. I'm going to change cooking utensils here so that we can make it into a soup. So let's get these vegetables into the pan here. Not going to take very long. We don't want that to overheat. There we go. Now in goes our beef broth. I've got, I don't know, it doesn't say how much, but as much as you need for your soup, obviously. Now it calls for, let's see, a little bit of salt, And although depending on your broth, it might have some in it. I've got a little bit of pepper. I'm going to go ahead and toss that in. And it actually calls for a little bit of flour in this to help thicken it up. I'm not going to add a lot because I'm not sure where it's going to go. And there's a thickener at the very end of this. As soon as this is basically done turning into our soup, we're actually going to thicken up with another ingredient. Well, our soup has been on. The vegetables or the roots are nice and soft, but they haven't broken down completely, which is what we're looking for here. The last part of this recipe is to actually get a little bit of a thickener in here with egg yolk, and they want us to basically temper some eggs here and then put them in as a thickener. So let me temper these egg yolks before I toss them in. We don't want to cook them, so we need to warm them up. So now we're going to go ahead and put these in. Okay, so this is ready to be served up now while it's still warm on top of a couple of sippets of bread. Here's our soup. Again, smells wonderful, has these wonderful savory smells to it, and it even has a real interesting look to it with the different color roots that are in here. We'll find out just what it tastes like. Woo, really good. Really, very good. I was worried that it was going to be, say, like a bland soup, but not at all. And almost a meaty flavor to it. This is a great mix of roots here, the carrots, parsnip, and the turnip. Many times I don't really care for turnip or parsnips that much, but this blended really well. So I'm loving the flavor of this particular soup. So really good. Welcome to 18th Century Cooking. We're going back into a wonderful old English cookbook, and we're pulling out this great recipe called Turnip Soup. Thanks for joining us today. So today's recipe is out of Hannah Glass's The Art of Cookery, and just recently Townsends has actually reprinted old cookbooks. This is exactly like Hannah Glass's cookbook in the 18th century. These are available now on Amazon. If you're interested in getting a print version of this cookbook, go down in the description section. There'll be a link there to follow. This recipe is actually rather complicated. Now, Eliza Smith, in a slightly earlier cookbook, has a recipe on how to dress turnips, and it is a similar recipe, but it's very, very simple. Hannah Glass's recipe, though, is for obviously a much more well-to-do table, and that's the one we're going to be doing today. So let's get started on this recipe, and it's a easy one to really get this first part going. We've got our cooking pot here, and I'm going to add, she calls for a gallon of water. I'm actually going to make this probably, let's say, half a recipe. So maybe a little bit more than a gallon of water. She also calls for a bunch of turnips. She says, bring a bunch. I'm not sure, maybe they always came in a certain quantity in the 18th century. I have no idea how much a bunch of turnips is, so we're just gonna, do our best here. She says, take these turnips and pare them, and then we're gonna put them in the water. And she doesn't say dice them up or anything, she just says put them in the water. She says to make sure, though, to save a couple out for a future part of this recipe. So not all of them are going in this pot right away. Next up, she calls for an onion spiked with cloves. Also, she says an ounce or half an ounce of whole peppercorns, and a blade of mace, and a half a nutmeg bruised. Now, I'm not sure exactly what she means by half a nutmeg bruised. Nutmegs are like little wooden blocks almost. So I just smashed the nutmeg up. I think the reason why she doesn't call for let's say grated is because later on we're going to strain this. So we don't want all this nutmeg to go through. We just want it to infuse our soup, but we don't want it to end up, chunks of it end up later on in the soup. So we've got half a nutmeg bruised here, or let's say a quarter of a nutmeg bruised, and we have a blade of mace is what she calls for. Unfortunately, I don't have any blades right here in the kitchen, so we're gonna put some ground mace in here. A bundle of sweet herbs. So I've got some sweet herbs here. I've got some thyme, sage. It's tied up in a little bundle, again, so that later on when we strain this out, this won't end up in the soup. And then she calls for a large crust of bread. So I've got some bread crust here. I'm just gonna toss this in also. This is ready to go onto the fire. And we're gonna go ahead, and she says to let this boil over a brisk fire, or boil briskly for an hour. Now that this has boiled up the hour, and it's time to strain this out. And I've got a strainer here, and we're trying to get all the, yeah, there we go. All that stuff out. Now, hopefully our turnips are still in a, solid enough piece that actually I'm gonna transfer our turnips into this bowl so that we can mash them. She calls for forcing them through the strainer. That can be very hard to do with some of these strainers. So it'll actually be easier for me to just mash them up in this bowl. So we do want to leave behind all the other parts. We want just the turnips in here. So now let's get these mashed up. Okay, now that our turnips are mashed up, we actually put all these right back into the pot and start this going again. First, we've got our liquid that we strained out earlier. Obviously, we've got our turnips that we mashed up. And some of the turnips that we actually saved out earlier on, we diced those up. So I've got one turnip basically diced up, and also it calls for some celery cut small, along with a few carrots cut small. So I've got some carrots, got some celery, and a little bit more of our turnips. Now this goes back onto the fire, and she also says to put the lid on this thing, keep it nice and close while it works up. So we're not done yet though. So let's get this on the fire. The last stage here are some turnips cut up small. We've got some carrots in there. We've got onions sliced very thinly. This is floured and then fried in butter. Once these are all fried up, they go back into the pot along with everything else and a little bit of vermicelli, and then we let this cook just a little bit longer. Well, there's our soup. Again, this one smells great. It took quite a while. It's a complicated soup, right? Obviously, for a more well-to-do table, it's got pasta in it. It's got these fried vegetables in it. Boy, let's find out what it tastes like. Now, she does say at the very end of this recipe, you probably want to salt it to your palate. Okay. I think I'll add a little bit of salt to this guy. Other than that, it's a wonderful complex soup. This one has so many different things in it. You can tell it has those fried turnips in at the very end, along with the carrots. It's got the celery, it's got the pasta, it's got all those wonderful spices that were in originally, the sweet herbs. You can taste all those, all hidden down in this kind of complex soup. Wow. Oh, the salt just brought it right there. So wonderful. And again, if you're interested in the print version of this particular cookbook, the Hand Glass Cookbook, this is a Townsend imprint of this version of the cookbook. You can find it if you follow the link down in the description section of this video. Such a wonderful recipe. As you go digging in these, you would, really, it is such a wonderful one if you get a chance, and it's that perfect time of year. Winter, it's kind of a time for warm soups and these winter tubers that are easily stored. So it's the perfect time of year for this recipe. Get a chance, try this one out. It's a really good one, if a little bit more complicated. Thank you so much for coming along with us as we savor the flavors and the aromas of the 18th century. Ivy, this is looking great, just in time for Christmas.
Thanks, Dad. What are we making today?
We are going to be making a recipe that's called the Little Deer Antlers. Thanks for joining us today.
So where does this recipe come from, Dad?
Well, this recipe is from The Raised Hearth. It's a book that the folks down at Old Salem, down in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, they're working on this cookbook that's got 2 translated German cookbooks kind of all into one. I think the title of the book is going to be The Raised Hearth. Some of the folks down there are Kayla and Karen. They've been working on this, and they sent us sort of a pre-publication version of this. And I was digging through this recipe book and found this recipe that looks like it'll be perfect for Christmas. It's called Little Deer Antlers, and it's in the section of the cookbook called Things Fried in Lard, so you know it's got to be good.
So what do we need for this recipe, Dad?
Well, this recipe, it's actually got measurements, unlike a lot of the recipes that we look at. But the measurements are in German. They didn't necessarily translate those for us. Let's see, it says 6 loaf of flour. What do you think a loaf is?
I have no idea.
So they had like a glossary. They said a loaf is something like a tablespoon plus a teaspoon. I don't know exactly what it was. I did some measurements and I came up with 2/3 of a cup of flour. So let's hope that's close to being right. It has sugar in it, and it says half a Vierling. Yeah, half a Vierling. Let's see, what did I come up with? 4 ounces of sugar. So I got 4 ounces of raw sugar there, and it also had half a Vierling of butter. So I got some cold butter here. It's got some other ingredients too. I think it says something like some lemon. What do you think it means? Some lemon. I love these recipes. It's like, put some lemon in it. Well, some lemon juice, some lemon, I don't know. So I have here lemon zest. We're gonna hope that works in this recipe. I've got zest from a half a lemon or zest from a lemon. It's got some cinnamon in it, which will make something nice and Christmassy, and it's got an egg in it. And then of course it says something like mix in with a little bit of milk at the end. So we need flour, sugar, butter, and then we'll add some of these other ingredients later on.
Sounds good. How do we start mixing this up?
I'll have you do most of the mixing here. Why don't you go ahead and let's mix all the dry ingredients up. So put your flour and your sugar, put the zest in there too. Maybe we won't use all the zest right away. I don't know how lemony we want this. There's all your sugar. Let's do a teaspoon of cinnamon there. Stir that up with your hands, get it all mixed in there. Now that all the dry ingredients are in there and kind of mixed up, bring in the butter. And you remember how we've done butter in the past where you kind of rub it in, you don't want to get it to melt on your fingertips. So you're going to put the butter in, you're going to mix it up, you're going to kind of rub it in. Ivy's doing a great job here getting this all mixed up. It calls for an egg and a yolk. They were probably working with little tiny eggs at the time, and I don't think we need as much. So I'm just gonna do 1 egg. This egg is all mixed up. We can put that in there and fold that in, and let's start to see what it turns into. See how much more moisture we need to have this. We don't want it to be a batter. We want it to be a dough. We want it to be stiff enough so that when we shape it into little antlers, that it holds its shape when we put it into the hot lard. So I'm gonna add just a touch of milk, although we don't hardly need any here. And go ahead and keep mixing that up. And now it's just a matter of adding a little bit of flour until we get to some kind of consistency. Okay, so let's get it out of this bowl. Go ahead and let's turn it out onto, or get it all out of there. There you go. And let's get a little bit of flour down here. Okay, so you keep working on this, getting it into a bit of a stiff dough here. And I'm gonna get the fire going on underneath our hot lard so that we can start to cook these. As soon as the fire's going, we'll start to shape these into our little antlers. Okay, so I've got the fat on the fire, and let me see this. Yeah, I think we've got the right kind of sort of cookie dough consistency. That looks good. And let's go ahead and try to make some antler shapes. So I think what we need to do is take a little section here that's about, I don't know, half an egg, right? Let's roll it out into a little hot dog shape there, and we'll flatten it out. Notice how it's kind of arched. I'm going to take 2 little cuts. You can do that with any kind of simple knife. Point the end a little bit, and point the little cut off piece, and like that. Look at that. So now we know what kind of shape to make them in. You keep making those shapes, and I'm going to check on our temperature over here. Well, they turned out great. We had a lot of fun cooking these things up, and let's find out what they taste like. You go ahead, Ivy. Those are good. Those are really, really good.
These are really, really good.
Imagine sugar cookie, but fried like a donut, okay? This is good. And these don't even have any icing, or, I mean, you could put icing on these. You could probably put powdered sugar on them if you wanted to go crazy. In the directions, it says to cut these in any shape you like, obviously. I mean, they're called little antlers, but obviously some of these are, Ivy did some star shapes.
I'm getting a little bit of the lemon and the cinnamon. I can taste the cinnamon, and it's definitely sweet.
Yeah, you could go probably a little heavier on the cinnamon or on the lemon. They're both kind of buried under there. So if you want to, get a little bit more of a little flavor, you can add that. You could probably go crazy and add some nutmeg to this to get a little different holiday flavor. Really good. In this episode, we're looking at the origins of ginger beer, and we're going to be making some ginger beer. Thanks for joining us today. Ginger beer is such an exciting topic, and a lot of people are really excited about it, so I really started digging into ginger beer lately, and it was really interesting, the research. When you get into the 18th century, you don't find a lot of ginger beer specific recipes. But when you get into the 19th century, they really start popping up and they're becoming very popular. Several weeks ago, I did a Q&A where we talked about ginger beers and ciders, things like that, and I read a recipe. And I think this gets to the heart of the 18th century sort of origins for ginger beer. Now let me read this one again. This one is from the 1737 William Ellis recipe for Philadelphia molasses beer. And in this recipe, they take 5 pounds of molasses, half a pint of yeast, a spoonful of powdered race ginger. They put these ingredients into a vessel. They pour on hot scalding water, 2 gallons. They let that clear. They add another 13 gallons of water, and then they let that ferment in a cask. It says let the liquor ferment for about 12 hours. That's it. And then bottle it off with a raisin or 2 in each bottle. Now this is 1737, and it isn't specifically called ginger beer. It's a molasses beer that has ginger in it, either as a sort of replacement possibly for hops or just as a flavoring. By the time we get to the early 19th century, ginger beer recipes start to pop up. Here's an 1811 recipe from the New Family Receipt Book. And in this recipe, they're using spring water, white ginger, loaf sugar, lemon juice, and then yeast. That's it. it's a little bit different process here. They go into the actual making of it just a little bit more than William Ellis's recipe, but again, very, very interesting and really just so simple. So we're going to get started making a very simple ginger beer. I'm going to take both of these recipes, kind of put them together and come up with a really fun one. Let's get started. The first thing we're going to need for our recipe, obviously, is a nice large cooking vessel. We're going to be doing a gallon batch, so we need some kind of cooking vessel that's going to work for at least a gallon here. I've got this wonderful copper pot that we're going to be working with. We need a gallon of water. And in the second recipe, she actually specifically talks about spring water. And as in all beers, water's the main component here, and it needs to be good, fresh, clear water. Many times in the early brewing, they talk about soft water. So we want to use really good water. So we've got a gallon of water here. The next ingredient is the sugar component of our ginger beer, and the early recipe called for molasses, and the ratio in that early recipe was something like a pound of molasses to 3 gallons of water. That's a pretty skimpy ratio. Most of the later ginger beer recipes call for approximately a pound of sugar or molasses to every gallon of water. So we're going to be using about a pound of sugars here. Now, the early recipe called for molasses, and many of the 19th century recipes call for molasses, and some of them call for loaf sugar or white sugar, sometimes even brown sugar. We're going to be doing a mix between the two because I really like some of the molasses flavor to come through in the ginger beer, but not too much. If we use the molasses that we find today in the grocery stores, what we typically find is blackstrap molasses, which is the last. Molasses is what's left over after they refine sugars, right? And they get out all the good white sugar, and what's left over is this brown goo. And blackstrap is the last stage of that, and it's very, very strong and not terribly sweet. In the 18th century, molasses was likely something, their version of molasses would have been something like Barbados molasses that you find today, or a light baking molasses. That can be very difficult to find. Generally, when I went looking recently, all I found was blackstrap. So I'm doing a mix here of molasses, and I've got because we got a gallon of water, about 8 ounces. Then the rest of the sugars, I'm going to be using a turbinado sugar. You could use standard white sugar. In the 18th century, turbinado sugar probably would have come in a great big hard brown lump, and we would have had to break it up with a hammer and sugar tongs. This fortunately is nice and broken up for us already. So we got about 8 ounces of brown sugar, turbinado sugar. So the next ingredient up is ginger. And I've got here powdered ginger. And this early recipe from William Ellis calls for either, sometimes it's referred to as race ginger or just powdered ginger. And when he says race ginger, he really just means the race of ginger is a ginger root. So it may have come in as a dried root or possibly already powdered. Now, we want it powdered for this purpose. We want it to go, kind of the flavors to go into the liquid. So powdered ginger is what we want here. And the ratio typically is about an ounce or so per gallon. Now, again, these recipes are all up and down. We can do whatever we want when we're making this recipe. If you really like ginger, you can use an extra quantity. If you're not a big fan of ginger and you want that molasses flavor to come through, then you can kind of not put as much ginger in, but an ounce of powdered ginger is a good place to start with a gallon. Powdered ginger has its own sort of gingery flavor. If we want an extra punch of kind of a fresh ginger flavor, then we can actually come in here and put in some diced ginger root, some fresh ginger. So I've taken one of these roots, I've chopped it up and diced it. This isn't as powerful a flavor really, and I really like ginger, so sometimes I might put in a whole bunch here. A couple ounces of diced ginger will work. If you really want to get some of these extra juices out of it, you can take a mortar and pestle and pound this up, bruise it, get some of the juices out of it. The last little ingredient here, which shows up in the 19th century recipes, is the lemon. And we're gonna put a little bit of lemon zest, and we're gonna squeeze 1 lemon's worth into this pot here. The flavor doesn't really pop right out on the lemon, but I think it's a nice little ingredient, and it shows up in so many of the recipes. So all our main ingredients, at least so far, are in the pot, and it's time to get this over the fire. So many times in these early recipes, they boil this thing for a long time. But it turns out all that we really need to do is sort of sterilize the components and draw out some of the flavor oils in this. So we really don't need to get this boiling very long, but we definitely need to get it up to a boil. So let's get this on the fire. So we've boiled this up for a little while. Really, it doesn't take that long. You can just bring it up to boil and then let it cool back off. We wanted to get it down to approximately 100 degrees, and we can feel the pot here. We can find out what temperature it's come down to. You want it to feel just slightly warm, or not, or just exactly your temperature, right? And now we're gonna strain this off. And here I've got a nice big bowl. You'll want a bowl. This one's probably not quite big enough. I might do this in 2 batches, but I'm just gonna strain off all the solids here, especially that diced ginger. Everything else is gonna probably flow right through here. Now that we're done straining, we've got our next step, which is, we're back down to blood temperature, about 100 degrees or so. It's time for the yeast. And this is what makes it beer, right? And other than that, it's just sugar water with some flavoring. What they typically did in the 18th century was they used brewer's yeast. They used yeast that they got from the brewer to do this. So the brewer would use his regular beer yeast in this situation. Of course, we don't have a brewer next door who has yeast left over, so we're gonna have to come up with yeast. And we can use a beer yeast that we get online or at a brewer's supply. We can use a champagne yeast if we want something that's a little cleaner flavor. Here, this is like a white wine yeast. And if you're in a historical context, you'll want to make up a liquid yeast, a barm, for this. So you could use one of these modern yeasts and make up this bottle of yeast. We've done that in previous episodes. I think the Wigs episode, where we actually show how to make an artificial barm, which is great. In our setting, we're gonna be using this kind of barm. I've just pre-soaked a little bit of this yeast. One of these packets does 5 gallons, so we don't wanna use the whole packet or we'll have way too much yeast. So just about 1/5 of one of these little packets. You could also, if you don't want to order something or find a brewer supply, if you're not in that kind of an area, you can use, in a pinch, you can use bread yeast, and it'll do some interesting things. It's not gonna work quite the same way. You might have to play with the ratios a little bit, but a little bit of active bread yeast might do the trick too. That's something you'll have to try out. I tried one batch, turned out pretty well. I mean, it didn't carbonate nearly as much, but I didn't kind of let it work as much either, so you might need a little bit. That's an experiment that you're gonna have to do at home. But this yeast is ready to pitch. I've just kind of pre-soaked 1/5 of one of these little packets, and we'll pour that into our batch here. Now it's time to let this set and ferment. And the recipes sort of vary on these. I'm just going to cover this bowl up with a cloth. I want to leave it in a standard room temperature situation. It generally says maybe 12 hours. Some of them say until it starts working. Other ones say until it stops working. There's so many different recipes and they each deliver a slightly different product. But what we're going to do is we're going to set this aside and let it ferment for probably 12 to 16 hours. I'll probably let this work overnight and then we'll come back and see how it's doing. So this has fermented. It's really working well now. This particular batch has taken about 12 hours. You can see it's really working well. Some of these recipes, they let this go a little bit longer, but many of them, it's time to bottle. So that's what we're gonna do with this batch. We're gonna pour this batch directly into bottles, and I've got some beautiful stoneware bottles here that we sell at the store. These are perfect for 19th century ginger beer bottles. You may not have these available. You can use glass snap top bottles, or if you don't have that available, in a pinch, you can even use a 2-liter plastic bottle that had pop in it, before. You can empty that out and put this ginger beer in it, because it's going to be working in this bottle. It's not done fermenting. It's actually going to continue to ferment in the bottle and pressurize the bottle. And that's why if we're using one of these ginger beer bottles, these ceramic bottles with corks, the cork got to be in there really well, or you actually have to wire the cork down, or it'll build up so much pressure it'll pop the top off. So you definitely want to be ready for this to pressurize itself. And so it doesn't get too pressurized, I would suggest refrigerating these things pretty much right away. If you leave these out and they're warm, that yeast will start to work, and it might work so much to explode your bottle. So you have to watch out for that, because there's still a lot of sugar here, and these yeasts will want to work on it. So make sure that your bottles don't explode. Be careful. Now, and one more thing, especially with this bottle, but every part of this process after it's come to boil, we have to make sure everything is very, very clean. So our bottles, we want to make sure that they are very, very clean beforehand. You should probably scald these bottles so that they don't bring any bacterias or anything in there that'll ferment along with your yeast. You want only the yeast doing the work and nothing else. So make sure everything is very clean, especially your bottles and all your other equipment that you're working with. So I know there are experienced brewers out there right now, and they're thinking, no, wait a minute, John, don't do that. You can't bottle this soon. And remember that, number one, in the 18th century, in the 19th century, this was meant to be a green beer, something that was drank basically right away. You're not going to keep this for weeks and weeks. So hopefully these bottles that you've put them away in, they're not going to continue to ferment so much that they're going to explode. The other thing is that many of these 19th century recipes, there seems to be something going on, some kind of suppression, that at some point this yeast stops functioning before the bottle explodes, before it's so carbonated that it's going to try to explode. We're not sure exactly what's going on with these recipes, and I've only made 20, 30, 40 bottles of this stuff. I haven't had any bottles explode yet, but one of the things I do with these is I put them in the refrigerator right away. That slows this action down so that it doesn't get too pressurized and exploded. I'm not sure what's happening in the 18th century, and I'm sure some of their bottles exploded in the 19th century or in the 18th century if they corked them up too well and they let them set where it's too warm, because there's still a lot of sugars in here, and this yeast is just wants to keep working on it and working on it. But so drink this stuff up right away. That's really the clue here. Don't let this set at room temperature for a long period of time, or you will likely have problems with this. Well, here is our nice poured ginger beer, and it's time to taste this. Now, this isn't the batch I just did on screen. This one's actually one I've done about a week or so ago. It's had a little bit of chance to age. Now, some of these you want to give it time. Some of these you can drink right away. If they're stored in the refrigerator, you can actually let them age. They on some of these recipes, they would say, oh, you need to drink these right away, because they weren't able to refrigerate them, then they wouldn't last. But other ones talk about cellaring them and saying that they're going to be good for a long time later. So there's a lot of variation in these recipes. Let's give this one a try. Wow, it has got some wonderful flavors, and it is I was worried about these kind of being a yeasty flavor. Many years ago, I experimented with some of these, and they ended up with a very yeasty flavor. But this particular recipe has none of that kind of thing going on with it. It's got some very, very nice, rich sugary flavors. It's not too sugary. If you don't want too much sugar, you can kind of let these ferment longer before you bottle them up. But this one's got a nice, wonderful sugary flavor. Some of that molasses flavor is definitely coming through. We haven't lost that, but it isn't overpowering. Again, I tried some of these with 100% molasses. All you could really taste was molasses, and that ginger kind of came in at the very end. This one, it's got some wonderful ginger flavors, wonderful molasses flavors that are along with it, wonderful flavors. This batch, tremendous flavors, and some nice little carbonation to it. So a lot of fun. So a great experiment. You can do this with the stuff you have in your kitchen. You can go out there and buy some of the equipment if you want to make it a little bit fancier, but it's just like what they would have done in the 18th century. Most of these things probably would have been made in the home, or could have been made in the home. These are table beers, something that anybody was going to be drinking. Later on in the 19th century, it becomes very industrialized and they make it by larger and larger quantities. But early on, it's more of a household thing. The recipe today is from Hannah Glass's classic Art of Cookery right there in the mid-18th century. It's going to be a good one. It's a jugged hare. Thanks for joining us today. So there has been a lot of chatter on in the comment section of the videos about, well, let's just say that Paul Mackenzie has been asking for rabbit or squirrel for, well, about half a year, over and over in every episode, and you're going to get some rabbit today. This recipe is a jugged hare. Now, obviously, we're in North America. We really don't have too many hares hopping around, but we do have the closest thing that we have available to us, which is a rabbit. And many times in the 18th century cookbooks, they talk about adapting hare recipes to a simple rabbit dish here. And so we're going to be using a rabbit to do a very, well, let's say a slightly adapted jugged hare recipe. Hannah Glass goes into some depth about the jugged hare. It is one of those sort of classic Hannah Glass recipes that gets talked about a lot. And jugged hare recipes do sort of start popping up in English cookbooks in the early 18th century, probably coming over from France, this idea of cooking a rabbit or a hare like this. And these recipes continues to show up in cookbooks in the 19th century, even some in the early 20th century, although I don't think very many people were actually cooking it by then. Let's get started. So this recipe starts out very, very simply. She says, cut it into little pieces. Now, I'm gonna admit to you right here that I am not an expert in cutting up rabbits into pieces. And this rabbit, obviously it's already been sort of dressed out. I don't have to worry about what's going on gut-wise or anything. I just need to break it up into pieces. So I'm going to remove the legs in pieces. Now, this rabbit is missing a lot of what they would have had in an 18th century hare or rabbit. We don't have the liver, which shows up in a lot of the recipes. They want to use that liver. They don't, obviously this rabbit doesn't have its head, which is another part that you see used a lot in these recipes. So our rabbit's all cut up into pieces here. The next step of this particular recipe talks about larding. She says you can lard this with little bits of bacon. And we kind of have to remember what we're working with here. This is a rabbit, and it's a domestic rabbit at that. She was probably referencing hare. Of course, it's a jugged hare. And both hare and rabbit are not known for having a lot of fat on their bodies. And that's why she's calling for larding here, to add more, say, oil to this situation. And larding in a hare, I'm not sure exactly how it would have been done, but larding has to do with injecting or putting in pieces of fat to the meat. And you would do that to particular kinds of cuts that don't have a lot of fat on their own. So you see them larding beef, you might see them larding venison, and in this case, rabbit or hare. Because this one is a domestic animal and it's a rabbit, I don't think we're going to need to lard it, so we're going to skip that step for now. So now it's time to put the meat into our cooking vessel. Now, it's called a jugged hare for a reason. They would have used something like well, something they called a jug, which is a lot like a pitcher, a very large open-mouthed vessel, a ceramic one at that. And what we're going to be using is one of our cooking pots. Now, our pot, our jug, as it were, has to be able to fit into a larger vessel. So that's something we have to understand when we're going to be doing one of these jugged hares. But we're going to use this cooking pot because we need to seal up the top. It's going to be easier to seal this. It's got a lid already built into it rather than sealing up something like this pitcher, which we could use as well. She says to put the pieces in our pot, and we have to put in some spices. It looks good. Our pot's about 2/3 full or so. She says it calls for a little bit of pepper, a little bit of salt. She says a blade or two of mace. I don't have any mace on hand right this second, so I'm going to put in the best substitute, which is nutmeg. Some of the other recipes you will find nutmeg going into the hare or rabbit recipes. We've also got an onion with cloves in it, onion spiked with cloves. Now you may say, okay, onion spiked with cloves, very common way of spicing this to get clove into it without leaving the clove. The nice part about having the onion with the clove in it is that it's very easy to remove. And you don't have to worry about picking all those cloves out. They'll all stay right there in that onion. It's a nice way to spice it that way. We need some sweet herbs to go along with this. This is thyme and some marjoram that we're going to tuck into the pot. We need to seal this up so the liquids can't disappear. So I've got some real soft paste. This is just flour and water, and I'm going to place it around the very outside edge of our pot. If we were using something like the pitcher, we might have sealed this up with a membrane, like a piece of bladder or even a piece of leather and cloth, and tied that off to seal it up. With this particular one, because we have the lid, we can seal it up with the paste. Okay, we've got a pot of water here. You can get it warm or hot. Really, it probably should be boiling. The problem is when you've got a boiling hot pot of water, it's hard to get what you want to get cooked without cooking yourself at the same time, right? So what I actually did was I did a twofold thing here. I tied the lid onto this pot just in case to hold it down tight. And at the same time, with that little bit of rope and cordage, I actually made a little handle so I can easily put this into the pot and take it out of the pot without burning myself. And that's going to make it a lot easier. So in our pot goes. We want to make sure that there's enough water, but we want to make sure this is sealed. You probably don't want to have water obviously coming up over the top of your pot because it'll get through that seal that we've put on there. That dough seal is only just going to work so well. And of course, when we've got boiling water, we've got some movement in the water, so we don't want it to be totally all the way up to the side. But you want the water to at least come 2/3 the way up. Now, once this is in its water bath, we can get it to boiling, and it's supposed to boil for approximately 3 hours. Well, I've let this cool down enough that I can handle it. It's time to open this up and see how it turned out. Let me just kind of peel this little rope thing off. That was kind of a trick there to get it so that it was tight enough that it didn't pop off when you were lifting it out, but you could still get it off. It looks like it's sealed up nicely. Hopefully we can get this lid off. There we go, perfect. Wow, the smell is wonderful, amazing. And this, well, doesn't look too beautiful yet, but certainly the smell is wonderful. Now, the recipe actually calls for removing the onion. We're going to take out our sweet herbs too. We'll go ahead and serve this up. She says just basically plate this and serve it up to the table hot. Well, now it's time to find out just how this one turns out. It's been quite a while since I've had rabbit, so let's find out. Wow, wonderful herby flavor. This is a domestic rabbit, so it's not gamey at all. In fact, it's very much like chicken, probably a little tougher than a standard chicken. And, you know, I might have done a little bit of larding on this to get a little bit more oils to it. Again, this is it's a, you know, can be drier because it doesn't have a lot of oils based in the meat itself. So I can see why, you know, she might call for that. So, you know, if I was going to keep tweaking this recipe, I'd probably play around with putting a little bit of larding in this. But, well, turned out wonderful. Smells wonderful. The taste is wonderful. It definitely softened up what can be a tough meat if you don't cook it properly. Here's another great recipe out of the 18th century German cookbooks that the folks down at Winston-Salem are working on translating. This one is an apple puree, or maybe we might call it baked applesauce. Thanks for joining us today. This recipe starts out very simply. It says take 8 apples, you peel them and cube them. Got a little bit of wine poured over the top of them. It's time to take them over the fire and saute them. The recipe calls for sauteing these guys until the wine evaporates. And this should soften them right up. Okay, these guys are right out of the pan, and this takes some interpretation here because the title of the recipe is apple puree, and the recipe says something like strain them. It doesn't say mash them, it doesn't say whatever, but obviously we want them to be something like applesauce, so I'm going to mash these guys up. Again, this is an experiment. You know, I'm taking this in for interpretation. These guys are mashed up, and it said to strain them. Now, I could strain them out, but I think I'm going to leave some body and not totally strain these out. I'm going to leave them with some of this mashed up apple here. Next ingredient here is whipped up egg yolks or egg whites. So I've got some egg whites, 6 egg whites, all whipped up nice and firm. I spared you having to watch me whip these up for an hour to get them looking decent, but I'm gonna go ahead and bring these into our mixture here. And I'll just stir them in a little bit. There's a little bit of bitterness coming in from the apple. I'm gonna add some sugar to this. And here comes some lemon juice. This is basically lemon juice from 1 lemon. And let's get this mixed in here. Again, I don't want to flatten up all my egg whites. Our apple mixture is ready to go into our pan. So I've got a well-buttered dish here. We're just gonna pour it in until we feel like it's about enough. I have no idea what this is gonna do when we bake it, so I don't want to go crazy with it. That looks good. You can just kind of flatten this out a little bit. Now this goes into the oven. It says something like 20 minutes. Oh, we'll see how long it takes. Probably say 375 or so. Again, that's a guess. This is from an 18th century cookbook. They had no idea, you know, exactly what kind of temperatures they were calling for. So let's get this in the oven at 350 for 20 minutes, see where it goes, and we'll bring it back. So let's give this a try. It looks really interesting, and it definitely has a really interesting texture. So let's see what it turns out like. Light and fluffy. I think I guessed about right on the sugar. You know, maybe just a little bit more. I think it depends a lot on the kind of wine you used. I mean, I used basically a sack or a sherry wine in this. So I think it turned out well, depending on what kind of wine you want. I can see how you really kind of want to taste that, that puree as the apples mixed up at the beginning. You want to test that and get that sugar content right. Now there's a texture issue too. I don't think this turned out right for me in this one. If I was going to do it again, I'd definitely make sure to see exactly how those egg whites went in, because I think that they sat long enough here while we were shooting that they kind of separated. And So I get too much like liquid egg in there. And possibly I want to strain out some of these excess liquids so that this would be light and fluffy and basically cook all the way through. We had difficulty getting this one cooked all the way through properly. At least I think that's what they were intending for this recipe. Again, since we don't have all the directions here and all the kind of understanding, especially what's maybe implied by the title, and so both through the translation of time and the language, it can be difficult knowing exactly what the original authors intended on this one. Still a very, very interesting, fun experiment, and a great tasting thing. And I'm sure if I had, 3 or 4 more tries at this, I might really get to exactly what it was supposed to be. Regardless, excellent. A fun one to try out. This one's a little bit different. It shows up in a lot of 18th century cookbooks, but we don't do it necessarily today. You know it's going to be good though because it's got bacon in it. This one's a bacon fraise. Thanks for joining us today. So this is another one of these recipes from the Universal Cook, 1773. The author was John Townsend, and he is the master of the Greyhound Tavern in Greenwich, England. So here let me read you this one so that you can kind of get an idea about what a fraise is, because he does explain it in this very simple, very short recipe. A bacon fraise. Take 8 eggs, beat them well together with a little cream and a little flour like any other batter. Fry very thin pieces or slices of bacon and pour some of this over them. And when one side is fried, turn the other, pour more over that. And when both sides are fried, serve it up. So it's sort of like a pancake with meat in the middle. In this particular circumstance, it's got bacon in the middle. Sometimes you'll see these where they actually do it with fruit, or say like apples. So take a thin slice of apple, they might fry it up, and then they'll take this batter, pour it on one side, put the stuff in. So we'll get started on it. Let's make up the batter for this. This one's so simple. I've got some eggs here. I'm going to half this. I don't know how many they were making, but 8 eggs and all. It's going to be a giant recipe. So we're going to half this. I'm using 4 eggs here. To the 4 eggs, I'm going to add some cream, half a cup. And we could add just milk. If we were making a less expensive version, we could make this with just water if we really needed to. But we're going to make this with a nice heavy cream. Now this is pretty thick. So we don't need a ton of flour. He just actually says a little bit of flour. I've just got some whole wheat flour here, and we're just gonna add that in until we get where we wanna be with this batter. There, our batter looks really good. It's the right kind of consistency. So now that the batter's ready, it's time to move on to the bacon. Today, I've got just regular wonderful bacon that I got at the store. I don't have any of that wonderful Ossabaw hog bacon that we got from Conner Prairie. I used it all up. Sorry about that. So today we're gonna be using just modern bacon. Let's get this in the pan. Okay, I've got the fire going here. I'm gonna keep a little bit of flame in the back just to keep the smoke out of the kitchen. But I've got a smaller fire underneath the spider here, and we're gonna toss in some bacon. I'm not gonna crowd the pan with bacon because we have to do a lot of work here. So I'm just gonna work with like 3 pieces or so, maybe 4 if they shrink up a lot. So I've got my 4 pieces of bacon just about right. We don't want to overdo it. We don't want to underdo it, but we definitely don't want to have raw bacon in the middle of these guys. So you want to make sure they're cooked up proper. So I'm going to distribute them around this pan. We don't have too much grease hanging out in the pan. That's good. So let's put some batter on top of these. I don't have a big spoon here. I'm going to go ahead and flip these up basically right away and get the other side coated. So when it looks like they're cooked basically up on both sides and you have a sufficient quantity of batter on both sides, they're done. It's time to pull them off. So obviously these guys smell great. All that wonderful bacon smell in the kitchen, it's great. And they're definitely interesting looking. Actually, as I was cooking them, I was reminded of that episode that we did with the German recipe where we took the bratwurst and we had the choux pastry dough. I think this probably is a pretty similar situation, except that we sort of cook the item and then put the stuff on top. Let's see what they taste like. Wonderful mix between the bacon taste and a flavorful pancake dough that goes over the top of that. And you know, what this makes me think of is, number one, we didn't put a lot of spices into the dough. It didn't have ginger in it, didn't have sugar, or it didn't have sugar, it didn't have salt in it. But with the bacon flavor comes all these other flavors, and it kind of flavors the dough properly. It seems to me like this might be a way that if you don't have a lot of bacon, but you want to have this sort of bacon dish, right? You want to make it seem like you have a lot of bacon, then you can do this with it. You can take these smaller bacon pieces and then you can cover them up and put the dough around them, and all of a sudden it's like you have a lot more bacon than you had before. Such a wonderful recipe, and one of these ones that's certainly different than anything I've experienced in a modern sense around here. You'd never see something like this, a Fraze, F-R-A-Z-E. One of those recipes that disappears in the 19th century cookbooks, but you see them in the 18th century cookbooks. Wonderful taste, wonderful flavors. It's so great to reach back into history. Bring one of these forward and try it out and reintroduce it to people and get them connected with their history. I love the flavors, love the tastes on this. Such a wonderful recipe and a great way for us to experience history. We're doing another one of these great 18th century German recipes today. And this one I have not done before. This is first time out, so we'll see how it turns out. This one's called yellow turnips. Thanks for joining us today. Okay, so this recipe is called yellow turnips, and we don't, at least here in this area, we don't call them yellow turnips. We call them rutabagas. Where you're at, you might also know these guys as Swedes. And I've basically taken one rutabaga and cut off the outer exterior and shredded it into little pieces. It actually calls for grated turnip. I hope it turns out all right since I just shredded this. I'm not sure exactly what kind of consistency they were shooting for in this recipe. It's tricky. I mean, we're translating both from the 18th century to the 21st century and from 18th century German into English, so sometimes we gotta take these things as they come. Anyway, there's our rutabaga all shredded up. I've also got some onion here. It says chop an onion fine. So we got a nice big white onion that I've shredded up. I'm gonna just kind of mix these up. And the recipe's kind of all over the place in the order of things. It actually calls for putting some of the spices in at this point, which I'm not gonna do that. I'm gonna wait to put some of these spices in until after we're sort of partially cooking this as we go. It says to basically take this and cook it with some butter. I think it means in a frying pan. So we're gonna fry this guy up in the pan here with some butter. As soon as that's all melted and hot, now we can add our shredded rutabaga. Well, these have softened up. That's what the recipe kind of calls for. It says once it's softened up, I can add some flour. Actually, at this point, I'm going to add some of the spices that were called for a little bit earlier. I've got some parsley flake here. It just says parsley. One of the things it calls for, which I don't think we've ever used in any of our cooking episodes, and that is cumin. So I've got some cumin here. I'm going to add, half teaspoon or so of cumin. Now it says once it's softened up, I've got the spices in. It says to add some flour, and this is the kind of thickener. It says about a spoonful, so I just added some. And now it says to kind of bring a sauce to it, In other words, give it some liquidity because there isn't, we've kind of, cooked out all the liquid here. I can add some broth. So I've got some beef broth here, not a lot. I don't want this to be, wet and sloppy, but I'm gonna add some broth to it. Okay, I admit it doesn't look the prettiest. And obviously at the very end of this recipe, it says that you can add some sweet cream, salt and pepper, nutmeg, or whatever spices you please. So I've got a little bit of sweet cream on here and some salt and pepper and just a touch of nutmeg. It was in the recipe. And rutabagas, okay, they're not my favorite. I'll just come right out and say it. But maybe I haven't had them the right way yet. Let's find out. Whoa. Wow. You really taste that cumin in there. And I think it balances these rutabagas or yellow turnips almost perfectly. I can taste the onions in there, kind of caramelized with the butter. Of course, I mean, you cook anything in butter, it's going to be good, right? But wow, I mean, I am astounded by what these guys did in here. I just totally didn't expect anything like this. This is meant as a side dish, and it's got some wonderful, really, really good balance of flavors. Maybe I just did it just right. Maybe it's me. I don't know. This one was really worth it toward the end. I want to thank you for coming along, experimenting with me, experiencing this dish that is pulled out of an old cookbook, a German 18th century cookbook that, I mean, you just would never guess exactly what you're going to find. I mean, we even had that question a couple weeks ago about, what other kind of recipes are lost? Well, this one may not be, I mean, maybe in Germany today, this is a common dish, or in other parts of the world. It certainly isn't here. And as far as I'm concerned, this one's lost. This was a lost recipe found and is wonderful. I want to thank you for coming along. As we do all these experiments, as we try these things out, as we live history, live these old recipes by bringing them back to life, by recooking and and trying them out and seeing how they turn out. It is such a wonderful thing, and I get so much feedback, and it really helps me understand how important it is as we kind of try out these things from history. So thank you so much for all your amazing support. Thank you for coming along with us as we savor the flavors and the aromas of the 18th century. Here's another great recipe from the John Townsend Universal Cookbook from 1773. This one is called a pancake pudding. I think this one's going to turn out great. So in the Universal Cook, this one's a pretty interesting recipe for the little nugget that's kind of carried in at the end. So we can get a little bit of idea about what he thought about this recipe and sort of maybe the roots or who it was for. He says, pour melted butter over it when it comes out of the oven. 'Tis a cheap and very acceptable pudding, being less offensive to the stomach than fried pancakes. So there we can see it's actually meant to be an inexpensive dish. Or at least based upon an inexpensive dish. This one does have brandy in it and some other items that make it a little higher class, but you don't necessarily have to put those in. And it's very acceptable. So he doesn't say this is delicious. And then he says it's less offensive to the stomach than fried pancakes. So apparently some people, maybe all that oil and fats in the frying didn't make them feel good, but a baked version of a pancake was acceptable to their stomachs. I'm not sure how different it really was, but he seemed to think so. So this is a very interesting one, and you can see how it's tied in with maybe less expensive cooking for the time period. let's look at the ingredients. The ingredients are simple. This is basically a rich pancake of the time period. So we have, let's see, what our first ingredient is a quart of milk. So I've got a quart of milk here, 4 eggs, 2 spoonfuls of flour. Who knows exactly how much flour they really mean in this one. Really what we're gonna do is get to a particular consistency with this batter, because it talks about basically making it up as a batter. So the flour is gonna be the thing we add until we get to the right consistency. We also have the standard sort of spice for pancakes. Ground ginger is the main spice in here. Obviously we've got a little bit of salt, and the last ingredient, which kind of again makes this a rich pancake, is we've got some brandy here. We can either use brandy, we could use sack. We don't have to use either of these if we don't want to. That just kind of spices it up a little bit. And we'll need a little bit of butter too, but not much. Now that we've got all our ingredients ready to go, all we need to do is basically whip all these things up into a batter. And let me just get our 4 eggs in there. Now I'm gonna go ahead and add in, it says a whole quart of milk. Let's add in some spices now. I've got, again, a teaspoon of ginger. Let me get this whisking in. I'm gonna go ahead and add in that pinch of salt here, maybe half a teaspoon or so. The last of my liquids, I've got some brandy here, as much or as little as you want on that. And on the ginger, you can add a little bit more ginger if you like that, or back off of the ginger. If you want to put a little bit different twist on your pancakes, or your pancake pudding in this case, a little bit of nutmeg, obviously put in quite often in the time period. Now let's bring in some flour and start to bring that into it till we get to our batter quantity. Looks good. We've got a nice battery kind of consistency, maybe a thin batter, but that's basically what the recipe called for. So we're going to go ahead and run with that as a thin batter. I trust John Townsend in this recipe book. Now let's go ahead and butter up a baking dish. Again, I'm just going to use another one of these redware pie plates. They're generally just about the right size, so that if you want to bake this in a Dutch oven, if you're at a camp situation, you're outdoors and you don't have an oven to bake in, you can use one of these pie plates and a Dutch oven and bake this right there on site at an event. Such a great way to experience history in a little bit different way. And really, we do need to take time to bake things like these at events, because that's what it's all about. Our dish is ready. I can just basically pour the batter in, and I don't want to overfill this. If I've got a little bit too much, well, you know, maybe I overshot on the batter, but it looks really good. Let's leave some space for this, because this is gonna bake and do a kind of a weird thing. They kind of bake faster at the edge, and they sort of build up a wall. So this'll bake and come out a little interesting looking. It won't look like a pie, that's for sure. But this guy's ready to go in the oven. Again, about let's say 350 degrees on this guy, and 35 minutes should bake this up. This might be a little thicker, so it might take a little bit more time than that, but somewhere in that 30 to 45 minute range, depending on the size of the pan you're using to bake this in. So let's get this one in the oven. The pancake pudding came out of the oven, looks wonderful. This one's cooled off just a bit, and it's ready to eat. I'm gonna try it plain. The recipe actually says something like, when it comes out of the oven, pour butter all over it. Okay, that's a very, very simple pudding sauce, right? I wanna try this without that, just to see what kind of flavors we have. And we can see it settles nicely. This one's got some color variation to it. So, remember in the text he called it acceptable. Okay, I think the pudding sauce, or what we do with this, is actually going to bring out most of the flavors. This is a very, very simple dish. So I created a pudding sauce, and we actually have an episode on nothing but pudding sauces. And if you want to go back and check that, I'll try to put a link in the description section for the pudding sauce. Here I've made up a simple pudding sauce. It's got some sugar, it's got butter, and some sack wine. You can put a little brandy in here or something like that. We don't need a lot here. Obviously today on pancakes, what do? We put maple syrup on them, or other people put other kinds of, just plain, granulated sugar or whatever. Let's find out what this one's like. More than acceptable. Very interesting, very simple, and in some ways it takes less effort and less time than frying up a bunch of pancakes, in the pan. Then you can serve it up sort of like a pie. Wonderful, interesting experience taking some of these recipes right out of this 1773 cookbook. I really want to thank everyone for coming along on this little journey. We're testing these things out. We're trying out things that maybe haven't been, cooked quite like this for hundreds of years. Maybe you cook something like this today, and that's some of these interesting things. Some of these are lost and forgotten in some areas, and then some families or some regions cook something almost exactly like this today. That's what I find so fascinating about some of these recipes. But I want to thank you for coming along, supporting us, watching these videos, giving them thumbs ups, commenting on them, sharing them online. Such an important thing that you do. And when you support us, we have people that support us on Patreon. Some folks come to our website and check out all these really interesting things that we have to sell. Pipkins and interesting plates, and all the cooking vessels that we use, all the clothing that we use for reenacting in the 18th century. Such a wonderful experience. I want to thank you for coming along with us today as we savor the flavors and the aromas of the 18th century. We're going to do another rabbit recipe today. This one is a Hannah Glass one called a brown fricassee. Thanks for joining us today. So Hannah Glass's cookbook, The Art of Cookery, is a mainstay of research for English cooking in the 18th century. It was probably one of the most popular of the cookbooks, and this recipe is a brown fricassee. And she says you can use rabbits, or you can use chicken. If you use a rabbit, you want to have the skin off. If you're using chicken, you want to use it with the skin on. Let's get started on this rabbit. Hannah Glass calls to have these our meat pieces cut up into small-ish pieces, and then we need some egg yolk. So I've got 3 egg yolks whisked up here, and then we're gonna bread these pieces. And let's make our sort of breading here. I've got standard breadcrumbs. A lot of people ask about what happens when you chip the loaf off, chip the crust off of an 18th century loaf of bread, which happened so often. Well, they turned them into breadcrumbs and they used them all the time in these recipes. So we've got breadcrumbs here. It also calls for a little bit of nutmeg in this breading mix. Hannah Glass calls for it. It's right here. And a little mace, which is the close cousin of nutmeg. So we've got some breadcrumbs here. We've got some mace and nutmeg, and they're all nice and mixed up. Now we just do the standard technique here. We're going to take our meat pieces, run them through the yolk, then through our breading. So apparently fricassee recipes show up in English cooking in the 16th century, probably coming over from France. Generally, at least early on, these fricassee recipes were a white sauce or a white fricassee, but this one, obviously right there in the title, she's calling this a brown fricassee. All these pieces are breaded now. It's time to go over to the fire and get a frying pan going so that we can brown these up. Our pan is nice and warm. I've got some butter melted in here, and let's put these in and get them browned. Now that our rabbit pieces are browned up, She says to actually take off any excess butter, but all the butter is cooked out here. We don't have to worry about that. And in go our liquid ingredients. We have some brown gravy that we're going to put in here. And this is a half a pint of white wine. I'm probably not using quite as much rabbit as she used, so I'm not going to use a ton of that. We can also bring in some mushrooms, she calls for, and a piece of butter rolled in flour. And now this is just going to simmer until it thickens up. Let me tell you, while this was cooking, the smells were incredible. This turns out as a wonderful smelling dish. I mean, it's a fricassee, so it isn't the most beautiful thing, but hey, let's find out what it tastes like. That's where the proof is, right? Well, get some of those mushrooms. Superb flavors and tastes. I can tell, I mean, this would make a really good chicken dish, but the rabbit works really well, especially in this brown fricassee. I think that's why she called for this. You can see poultry kind of going into a white fricassee, but in this brown one, you want more of that earthy flavor, like the dark meat of a chicken. That's what rabbit's like. This has got some wonderful flavors and tastes in it, and it takes a little bit of time on this. You really do kind of have to let it cook for a while, like so many of these period recipes, but it turns out wonderful. It would be perfect for a historic home setting if you're doing a period meal. You could do this over a campfire. It might be a little trickier. It takes a little bit of time. You definitely have to control that flame and not overcook this meat when you put it in that frying pan. But such a wonderful dish.